Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. I've always been curious about the old tram that runs through the city, but nobody ever seems to get on it. No one talks about it, and it's always the same, rusty, eerie, and forgotten by time. It's the kind of tram you see from afar, maybe notice the flicker of its lights through the mist, but never think about boarding. That is, until one cold evening when I found myself standing at the deserted tram stop. The sky had already darkened by then, a gray twilight that seemed to stretch on forever. My footsteps echoed eerily along the empty street, and the distant hum of city life felt strangely muted. As I walked past the rows of silent buildings, the old tram slowly appeared, emerging out of the fog like some spectral presence. Its wheels screeched as it came to a halt in front of me. The door creaked open. I paused, staring at the empty interior. There was no one aboard, just the flickering lights and the heavy silence that hung in the air. Something about the tram, the way it stood there, waiting for me, stirred a feeling deep inside. Maybe it was loneliness, or the strange urge to break free from the mundane. Maybe it was just curiosity. I stepped onto the tram. The air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. My shoes clicked against the warm floorboards, and I could hear the faint hum of the tram's engine, which seemed to struggle against the stillness. There was no driver, no passengers, just me and the quiet. The doors slammed shut behind me with a jolt, and for a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of what I had just done. The tram lurched forward, and I instinctively grabbed the nearest pole to steady myself. Through the cracked windows, I saw the streetlights of the city blur past, but something about the movement felt wrong. The air grew colder, and the lights outside flickered unnervingly. A sudden chill ran up my spine as the tram picked up speed. It was as though we were leaving the city behind, slipping into another world. I glanced around, but there were no signs, no familiar landmarks. The tram wasn't on its usual route. It was as though it was taking me somewhere no one had been before. My pulse quickened. I should have gotten off, should have found a way to stop it, but I stayed frozen in place. Maybe I had been too curious, or maybe the isolation I felt in that moment made it easier to just let go. The more I looked out the window, the more the city seemed to fade. The buildings became distorted, as though they were melting into the shadows. The streetlights outside twisted into strange shapes, casting long, eerie shadows across the tram's interior. The silence was oppressive, and yet, the farther we traveled, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. A whisper of sound, a soft, shuffling noise from the back of the tram. I spun around, heart racing, but the seats were empty. There was nothing there. My breath quickened. I turned back to the window, trying to calm myself, but the darkness outside seemed to press in closer. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as though they had a life of their own. I felt my chest tighten, my mind racing to make sense of it all. The tram moved faster now, and with each passing second, the sound behind me grew louder, closer. It wasn't just a shuffling anymore. Now, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but the only thing I could do was hold onto the pole and try to steady my breath. And then, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the tram was plunged into complete darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, breathing. The air felt thick, suffocating. A shadow moved across the floor, creeping towards me, and I could hear the soft scrape of feet against the floorboards. I wasn't alone. The lights returned with a sudden flash, and I saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the tram. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was undeniable. My body went rigid with fear, but I couldn't look away. Something about its stillness, its unnaturalness, filled me with dread. The tram jerked again, and I lost my balance, crashing into the seat beside me. I scrambled to my feet, but the figure didn't budge. It was as though it was waiting for me, or watching me. A sudden thought struck me. What if this tram wasn't just a ride? What if it was taking me somewhere I shouldn't go? And as the tram hurtled forward, I couldn't help but wonder, where was it really going? The tram seemed to pick up even more speed, and the world outside became an indistinguishable blur of shadows and fractured light. I pressed my hands against the cold glass of a window, feeling the vibrations of the wheels beneath me. The figure in the corner, that unsettling presence, hadn't moved an inch, but I could feel its gaze on me. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. I tried to steady my breathing, fighting the panic that was slowly creeping up my chest. The stillness around me was suffocating. The tram had become an extension of the eerie silence that had taken over everything. Even the hum of the engine had softened, almost as if the tram itself had become aware of the tension in the air. The strange thing was, if I hadn't known better, I would have said that the tram was no longer moving through a city, but through a dark, empty place. There were no more buildings outside, no streetlights, no signs of life. Just the endless void of darkness, stretching out in every direction. I turned back to the figure, but it wasn't there anymore. I blinked, my pulse quickening. It had vanished, like a shadow fading into the walls of the tram. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a cold sweat creeping down my spine. Was I imagining things? Was this some kind of dream? Suddenly, the tram lurched again. This time, the motion was violent, like something had pulled at the very foundations of the vehicle. I was thrown against the side of the tram, but I managed to catch myself. The doors to the conductor's cabin, which I hadn't noticed before, suddenly slammed open with a deafening crash. A cold gust of wind rushed into the cabin, carrying with it a faint, hollow sound. It was almost like whispers. The air inside the tram turned frigid, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, not from any one direction, but all around me. I couldn't make out the words, just the faint, indistinguishable murmur of voices, as if 1,000 conversations were happening at once. I backed away from the cabin, my feet dragging across the floor as I moved toward the rear of the tram. That's when I noticed it, a small crack in the wall, barely noticeable at first. But as I stepped closer, I saw it widen, revealing a faint flicker of light from the other side. A tunnel? I couldn't be sure, but the light behind the crack seemed to pulse rhythmically, as if something were drawing near from beyond. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was this the way out? Or was it another trap? Before I could decide, the tram jerked again, this time far more violently than before. I lost my footing and fell to the floor with a loud thud. For a moment, the whole world seemed to tilt, as if we were teetering on the edge of some unknown abyss. The tram groaned, its metal frame creaking under the pressure, and I felt a cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The tram came to an abrupt halt, the noise of the wheels grinding to a stop filling the silence. The cabin was now completely dark, the only source of light coming from the small crack in the wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly pushed myself to my feet. I had no idea where we were, or if we were even still anywhere. I moved toward the crack, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold metal of the wall. The whispers had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. My eyes darted around the dark cabin, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was nothing. But then I heard it. A faint sound, just beyond the crack. Footsteps. I froze. The steps weren't coming from the direction I had expected. They were coming from inside the wall. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was pacing behind it, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The crack in the wall widened just a little more. A gust of cold air brushed against my face, and I instinctively stepped back. There was something there, something just on the other side. The tram lurched forward again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just the movement of the tram, it was as though the very space itself had shifted. I could feel the walls of the cabin closing in around me, the air growing thick with the oppressive weight of something unseen. I glanced toward the rear of the tram. The seats were empty now, and the atmosphere felt suffocating. The silence was deafening, save for the whisper of my own breath and the distant sound of footsteps, getting closer. Without thinking, I rushed toward the crack in the wall. As my fingers brushed against it, I felt the air grow colder. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my ear against the metal, trying to listen. But what I heard wasn't footsteps anymore. It was breathing. Slow. Steady. Heavy. Something was right there, right behind the wall. The tram suddenly jerked again, this time throwing me off balance completely. I stumbled backward, crashing into a seat. My mind raced, and in that moment, I realized just how hopeless my situation was. The tram wasn't taking me somewhere. It was taking me nowhere. And whatever was following me was closer than ever before. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, pressing down like the weight of 1,000 eyes. I couldn't move. The breath in my lungs felt caught, trapped in my chest, as if the tram itself had become an extension of the oppressive presence surrounding me. The walls groaned, and the dark corners of the cabin seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if the shadows themselves were alive. The breathing behind the wall grew louder, more pronounced. It wasn't just a single breath anymore. It was a rhythm, deep and uneven, like something, or someone, was trying to steady itself in the darkness. I couldn't tell whether it was human or not, but I felt its presence all around me, pressing in from every direction. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thundering in my ears. I had to move, had to do something, anything. But where? The tram felt like a cage now. The seats, the walls, even the windows, everything was closing in, trapping me in a space that no longer felt real. I glanced around, looking for an escape, but the cabin was just as it had been, old, dilapidated, and utterly silent, save for the oppressive breathing and the ominous feeling that something was waiting for me. I turned back to the wall, where the crack was slowly widening, the faint pulse of light still flickering from beyond. It beckoned to me, tempting me to approach, promising an answer or an escape. But what if it was a trap? What if the figure, the one I had glimpsed earlier, was waiting for me just beyond that crack? Suddenly, the tram lurched forward again, violently, and I stumbled once more. This time, the motion didn't feel like a normal stop or start. It felt like the tram was falling, as if the ground beneath us had disappeared and we were descending into some dark abyss. My stomach lurched, and I gripped the nearest pole, trying to steady myself as the cabin shook with an unnatural force. But through it all, the breathing didn't stop. It only grew louder. It was right next to me now. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and my eyes locked onto the corner of the tram where the figure had once been. This time, it was different. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a form, barely visible, but undeniably there. A shape that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence, like it was part of the tram itself, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its face a blur of darkness. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, like it was studying me, waiting for something. It was as though I had become its prey. And then, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward, its limbs creaking with each motion, like an old wooden door opening after years of neglect. The air around it seemed to distort, as if the very space was bending around its presence. I could see its shape more clearly now, and the horror of it made my heart stop. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. I didn't have time to think. I just reacted. I sprinted toward the back of the tram, my feet pounding against the worn floorboards, my breath ragged. The figure didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It was already there, standing between me and the exit. Every step I took, it seemed to move closer, like it was closing in around me, forcing me into some corner I couldn't escape from. Desperation set in. I had to get out. I had to find a way to stop the tram, to break free from whatever nightmare I had stepped into. I reached the back of the tram, my hands trembling as I grasped the metal door handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than anything I had ever felt, and I yanked it open with all the strength I could muster. The outside was not what I expected. It wasn't the familiar city streets, or even the empty darkness I had seen earlier. It was something else. Something strange and distorted. The sky was a deep shade of purple, swirling with unnatural clouds that seemed to twist and writhe as though alive. The ground beneath the tram was cracked, like the earth itself had been torn apart. And in the distance, I could see shapes, large, towering silhouettes moving slowly through the haze, their outlines shifting and changing. I hesitated, my body frozen in place. What was this place? Where was I? The tram had stopped moving, but I could still hear the footsteps behind me. The breathing. The figure was closer now, only a few feet away, its shape solidifying in the dim light. Its presence was suffocating, and the air around me felt thick, like I was breathing in something wrong. I knew it was too late to escape. The tram had taken me somewhere else, somewhere I didn't belong. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, larger than the rest, standing still in the center of the desolate landscape. Its eyes were fixed on me, and in that moment, I realized with horrifying clarity that this world was not just a place. It was alive. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light, it was all part of it. Part of something far older, far darker than I could ever comprehend. I turned back to the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside once again. The tram began to move again, slowly at first, but then with a sudden, terrifying speed. I wasn't in control. The tram wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a force, pulling me deeper into this twisted realm. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't going to make it out. At least, not the same. The tram continued on, and all I could do was brace myself for whatever horrors awaited in the next station. The tram shook again, its rattling frame groaning like an old house in a storm. The eerie hum of the engine was louder now, as though something far darker had taken control. The figure, its presence growing stronger with every passing second, was still there, standing just out of reach. Its hollow form loomed like a shadow that was part of the tram itself, its grotesque features now more defined. I pressed my back against the wall, desperate to create distance between myself and that thing. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its eyes on me. Those hollow eyes, empty and deep, filled with an understanding that chilled me to the bone. It knew something I wasn't supposed to know. The tram jerked forward once more, and this time the motion felt off. As though we were no longer moving on tracks, but through something altogether different. The walls of the tram warped with each turn, and the once familiar creak of the wheels was now a low, guttural sound, like the tram itself was breathing. I stumbled down the aisle, trying to find something, anything, that might give me some answers. But the tram was empty. The seats, the windows, the overhead lights, all were faded, warped, like they didn't belong here. Nothing made sense. The familiar hum of the city, the smell of fresh air, everything had vanished, replaced by this suffocating, unreal atmosphere. And then I saw it. The wall at the back of the tram was no longer just a wall. It was a door. A massive, iron door that hadn't been there before. It stood tall, cold, and imposing, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the cabin like a blackened stain. The whispering from beyond the door was faint at first, like a distant chant, but it grew louder the closer I got. My feet moved instinctively toward the door, though every part of my mind screamed at me to stop. There was no escaping this tram. It was pulling me towards something, and I had no choice but to follow. The whispers now sounded like voices, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to blend together into a single, hypnotic rhythm. I reached for the door handle, but before my fingers could touch it, the tram lurched again, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered, and the whispers became screams. Not human screams, these were otherworldly, distorted, as if the very fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. I shoved myself up from the floor, fighting the dizziness that gripped my mind. I had to get out. There was no time to waste. I grabbed the door handle, and this time it turned easily, as though the door was waiting for me. A gust of cold air rushed into the cabin, and I hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness beyond. There was something out there, something I couldn't see, but I felt it. A presence, looming just beyond the threshold. I stepped forward, the darkness swallowing me whole as I crossed into whatever this place was. And then, suddenly, the tram was gone. The once familiar cabin was no longer behind me. I stood alone in a vast, empty space, nothing but blackness and the sound of my own breath. There was no floor, no walls, just endless void. I looked around, disoriented, as my heart pounded in my chest. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't the same figure that had been aboard the tram. This one was larger, more imposing, its shape flickering in and out of existence, as though it didn't belong in this world at all. The air grew heavier around it, the temperature dropping drastically. I could feel my body shaking from the cold, but the fear in my chest was far worse than the chill. It moved slowly, its presence growing larger with each step, until it stood directly in front of me, towering over me like some ancient being from the darkest corners of the earth. Its face was a blur of shifting shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it were studying every part of my soul. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, though its lips didn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me, echoing in my mind. I tried to speak, to shout, to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body refused to obey me, frozen in place as the figure loomed closer. I could hear its breath now, deep, ragged, like it was pulling air from some far-off realm. "You are not meant for this place," the voice continued. "You cannot return." I tried to move, tried to back away, but the figure's presence was overwhelming. It had no shape, no form, just darkness that seemed to twist and distort reality itself. The air around it vibrated, and I could feel my sanity slipping, like I was losing my grip on everything that was real. "No one escapes," it whispered again, its voice sharp and final. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was to come. The tram had taken me to the edge of this dark world, and there was no going back. No escape. I had become part of it, part of whatever this place was. The world around me began to spin. My body felt weightless, as if I were being pulled apart by some unseen force. The last thing I saw before everything dissolved into darkness was the figure's eyes, empty and eternal. And then, there was nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the tram stop. I could hear the faint hum of the city in the distance. The streets were familiar again, the buildings intact, and the air was warm, just like it had been when I first stepped out of my apartment. The tram was there, sitting idle at the stop, its lights dim but steady. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything, thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw my hands, cold, shaking, covered in sweat. I felt it. The darkness, the weight of the other world still clinging to me. I looked up at the tram. It waited for me. I knew I should walk away, forget what had happened, never step onto that tram again. But I couldn't. There was something about it, something that called to me. I stepped forward, and the doors opened. As I stepped onto the tram once more, a strange, haunting familiarity washed over me. The doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, and the cabin, though just as old and dilapidated as before, felt different. It wasn't just the physical space, it was as if the tram itself recognized me, as if it knew I had been here before. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't turn back. I sat down, my body moving on autopilot, almost as if I were being guided by invisible hands. The air inside was thick, heavier than before, and yet the city sounds outside, once muffled, now felt far away, distant, like a dream fading at the edge of consciousness. The familiar hum of the tram's engine started up again, though it was softer now, almost like it was whispering to itself. The cabin felt emptier than usual. It was as if the presence I had felt before, the one watching from the shadows, was no longer there. But that didn't comfort me. No, something was worse now, something was wrong. The silence pressed against me, suffocating in its stillness. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the same distorted landscape, the dark, empty expanse. But the city was still there, or at least it seemed like it was. The buildings, the streets, the faint glow of streetlights, they all appeared normal, ordinary. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that everything I had known was slowly slipping away, piece by piece. I turned to look at the front of the tram, expecting to see the conductor, but the cabin was empty. Not even the faintest shadow moved in the front, no flickering light from the cabin door. The tram was running itself now. The thought sent a jolt of panic through me. I got up, my feet dragging against the floor, and walked cautiously to the front, where the driver's seat should have been. The air around me felt colder as I approached. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the door leading to the conductor's cabin and slowly pushed it open. Inside, the space was as empty as the rest of the tram. No conductor. No equipment. Only shadows clinging to the corners, as though the very essence of the place was being swallowed by an invisible force. But then I heard it again, the faint whispering, just like before. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder. Not from the walls, not from the air. It was coming from the floor. From beneath the tram. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the cold metal floor, the whispering growing louder and more distinct with every passing second. My heart raced, my breathing quickened. The whispers turned into voices. I could make out the words now, though they were fractured and distorted. It's not over. You haven't left. You can't escape. I jerked back, my hands trembling. The sound didn't stop. It was still there, reverberating through the metal, through my bones. I felt sick, like something inside me was being torn apart by the sheer force of it. My head spun. I had to get out. I turned and bolted back to my seat, but as I did, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a figure standing at the back of the tram. It wasn't just any figure. It was the same figure from before, the one I had seen on my first ride. But now it was different. It wasn't hidden in shadows. It was here, in the light, its form sharp and unmistakable. It was towering. Its face was still a blur, a mass of shifting darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking, knowing. Its mouth stretched wide in an unnaturally long smile, and I could hear its voice, not just in my ears, but inside my mind, its words sinking deep into my skull. You thought you could leave. You thought it was over. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was here, again. It had followed me back. I had been so sure that escaping meant returning to reality, to something familiar. But now I realized it wasn't over. It had never been over. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The tram lurched forward suddenly, its momentum throwing me off balance. The lights above flickered and dimmed, and the figure moved closer, its presence filling the cabin. The darkness that followed it grew, spilling out like smoke, crawling across the floor, up the walls. Then, I saw it. In the middle of the tram, the floor began to crack, long fissures appearing in the wood, like veins, spreading rapidly, filling the cabin with an unnatural energy. The crack widened, the ground trembling beneath me as if something beneath the tram was rising, slowly, but with dreadful certainty. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The tram was accelerating now, faster than I had ever felt before. The walls of the cabin seemed to warp, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. The door to the conductor's cabin slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside the cabin with the figure. The air grew colder, the whispers growing louder, becoming a cacophony of voices, rising in volume, overlapping, as if the tram itself were alive. I felt the cold from below, creeping up my legs, encasing me in ice. The shadow at the back of the tram stretched further, reaching out, its mouth splitting open wider, its laughter filling the cabin, shaking my very soul. You can't escape this time. The tram continued its wild ride, speeding up, the world outside nothing but a blur, and inside, I could feel the tram itself changing. The walls weren't walls anymore. The ceiling wasn't the ceiling. The tram was becoming something else, something far darker. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I felt the tram stop. A complete, unnerving silence followed. The laughter, the whispers, the cold, it all vanished in an instant. I was frozen in place, every muscle in my body locked tight with fear. My heart raced, but there was no sound. I dared to look around. The figure was gone. The tram was still. And in that instant, I realized with a shock so powerful it stole my breath, this was not the same tram. This was not the same world. The tram had changed me. It had taken something from me. And now, I was its passenger. The doors creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate in my bones. Outside, I could see nothing. Just darkness. I had no choice but to step off. As I crossed the threshold, I felt something behind me, in the shadows, waiting. I wasn't sure if I had escaped or if I was only beginning. The tram had only just begun. Have you ever felt the wind speak to you? At first, I thought it was just my imagination, something harmless, just the wind brushing through the trees. But now, I'm not so sure. My name is Ethan, and I live in a small house on the outskirts of a town surrounded by forests. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and everything feels safe and predictable. There's a certain peace to living out here, where the air smells of pine and the only sounds are the birds and the rustling of leaves. But lately, something's changed. Something I can't explain. It all started one evening, just like any other. I was sitting on my porch, staring out at the endless stretch of trees that surrounded my home. The wind was soft, gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and wood. I was lost in thought, thinking about the day ahead, when I heard it. At first, it was barely audible, like a soft murmur carried by the breeze. I turned my head, expecting to see someone passing by, but there was no one. The trees were still. Yet, the voice seemed to come from the wind itself, a soft, insistent whisper that sent a chill up my spine. Leave, before it's too late. I froze, heart pounding. My first thought was that I was imagining things. The wind had a way of playing tricks on your mind, right? Perhaps it was just a bird or some other animal rustling in the bushes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had been real, too real. I looked around again, but the porch was empty, the forest just as still as before. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. The wind was calming, after all, and I had no reason to be afraid. I tried to focus on the evening, on the quiet and the peace that usually enveloped me. But the whisper had left an unsettling mark on my thoughts, and I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. I tried to shake the feeling as I went inside, locking the door behind me. But while I lay down to sleep that night, I couldn't escape the thought. The voice, it was like something was trying to warn me. I had heard it, clear as day. And there was no mistaking it, the wind had spoken. The next day, I went about my usual routine, work, chores, the simple things that kept me grounded. But as I walked through the woods behind my house later in the afternoon, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. It was as if the very atmosphere had shifted. I paused by the old oak tree, my favorite spot, and listened. For a moment, all I could hear was the distant call of birds and the faint rustle of leaves. But then, that familiar whisper returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakable. You should have left. It's coming. It's too late. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees, the sky, the vast, empty space of the forest stretching out in front of me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I wasn't imagining this. This was real. And it was coming from somewhere in the wind itself. I stumbled back toward the house, my mind racing. Was I losing my mind? Was there something out there, something I couldn't see, that was trying to make itself known? Or was it all in my head? That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the wind whispering to me, the words haunting me, repeating in my ears. It's too late. It's already here. The feeling of dread grew with each passing hour, and by the time dawn arrived, I was no longer sure what was real. The wind had taken on a new tone, a sharper edge. It no longer felt like a comforting breeze, but something alive, something aware, that was following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The following days only made things worse. Every gust of wind, every shift in the trees, brought more whispers. They weren't just warnings anymore, they were threats. They knew my name now. They knew my fears. And they were closing in. You're not safe. It knows where you are. Each whisper was sharper, more insistent. I couldn't escape it. The wind was everywhere, surrounding me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I began to feel it. The wind wasn't just speaking to me. It was speaking through me. It was manipulating the air, the trees, the very fabric of my reality. With every passing moment, the world around me seemed to bend, as if something unseen was controlling it. I tried to leave, tried to get away from the forest, but no matter how far I went, the wind followed. It was as though it was guiding me, pushing me in a direction I couldn't resist. No matter where I went, I could hear it, the whispers, the threats, the warning. It had me, and I had no choice but to listen. The wind had a voice, and it had something it wanted from me. And now, I was afraid I might never be able to leave this place. I thought I could ignore it. I thought I could push the whispers aside, chalk them up to stress or paranoia. But that was before the storm came, before the wind changed. It was a night like any other, cold and still. The wind had died down, and the night seemed peaceful again. But then, just as I was beginning to feel safe, the wind picked up once more. At first, it was subtle, a soft breath on the air. But then it grew. It was like a rumbling, as though the earth itself was waking up. I looked out the window, watching as the trees swayed in the growing breeze. The sky was darkening, clouds swirling unnaturally fast, as if something was stirring within them. The wind began to howl, its voice rising louder, the whispers now drowned out by the violent gusts. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. The voice, cold and menacing, cut through the storm. It's here. And it's angry. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the wind screamed against the house. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else. Something that was using the wind as its weapon, something that was alive, and it was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want? The wind pressed harder against the house, rattling the windows, shaking the walls. And then, with a deafening crack, the door burst open. The storm was in here with me. The whispers had stopped. But now, there was something worse. The wind wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. It was right behind me. I turned, panic surging through me. The door, which I had bolted shut just minutes ago, was wide open now, its frame shaking with the power of the wind. The storm outside had become a howling, furious beast, and yet the air inside the house was eerily still, as if something unnatural had taken hold of the space. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stepped back, instinctively trying to retreat into the shadows, away from the door. The wind didn't just howl anymore, it was more than that. It was a pulse, a rhythm that seemed to beat in time with my own heart. The soft whispers that had once haunted me now swelled into something almost tangible, as though they were creeping under my skin, pulling at my thoughts. It's here. It's found you. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, a chill that crawled up my spine, deeper than any cold night breeze could reach. The room felt wrong, foreign. The space I had once felt so comfortable in was turning against me. I glanced toward the door again, but all I could see now was a dark figure standing in the threshold. It wasn't a person, at least not fully. It was like a shadow, stretched out and obscured by the storm, its outline shifting with every gust of wind. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to lift. The whispering was louder now, surrounding me, drowning out the sound of the storm outside. Run, Ethan, or stay and face it. It's all the same. The voice wasn't coming from the figure, but from all around me. From the wind itself. It was all-consuming, omnipresent. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. I wasn't just hearing whispers. The wind, the storm, the very air was alive. And it was not just communicating with me, it was controlling everything. The shadow in the doorway shifted, and I could see more of it now. It was a shape, an outline of something human but twisted, its form too dark and indistinct to be real. But I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. The presence behind it was far too powerful. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of it. My hands fumbled for something, anything, to hold on to. My thoughts were racing. Why hadn't I left when I first heard the warnings? Why hadn't I listened? The shadow moved toward me, and with every step, the whispers grew louder. It was like the wind was alive within me, rattling my thoughts, prying at my sanity. The air seemed to thicken around me, almost suffocating. The figure loomed closer, a dark, swirling mass that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the storm. And I could hear its voice now, deeper and more menacing. You should have listened. You should have left. I stumbled backward once more, this time reaching for the door. But the air was too thick, the wind too strong. My hand closed around the cold handle, and it was as if I could feel the pulse of something dark and ancient there, something that wanted me to stay, that didn't want me to leave. Then, suddenly, the wind stopped. The whispers cut off. The storm outside went still. And in that silence, I heard it again. A voice, but not from the wind, not from the shadow. It was closer now, almost like a breath at my ear. Don't go outside. The words were cold and final, as though spoken from somewhere deep within the earth, from a place that had never seen the light of day. I froze, my body locked in place. Something in me screamed to run, to flee. But I couldn't. The air was suffocating, the shadows closing in, and it felt like there was nowhere left to hide. I spun around again, my eyes desperately searching the room. The wind was silent, but it still felt as if it was there, listening, waiting. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The shadow, the figure, was gone. But I felt its presence still, lurking, just beyond my vision. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the wind. I turned toward the window, my hand shaking as I tried to pull the curtain back. I needed to see the outside, the world beyond the storm. But when I looked out, all I saw was darkness. Not the night sky, not the trees swaying in the breeze. Just a black, empty void. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, my mind whirling. Was I still inside my house? Was I even in the same world anymore? The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crack, and the wind surged once more, swirling violently through the room. I gasped, clutching at my chest as the air filled with a loud, deafening roar. The whispers were back. No longer quiet, no longer gentle. They were furious, angry, filling the air around me, suffocating me. You cannot leave. You are ours. The air grew colder. I could see my breath now, freezing in the sudden chill. The walls of my house seemed to close in, bending, warping, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The wind was no longer just a sound, no longer just a whisper. It was a force, pushing against me, pulling me towards something terrible. I turned again to the door, but the moment my hand touched the handle, it ripped open on its own, violently swinging back. The storm outside poured in, wild and uncontrolled, a maelstrom of wind and darkness. I could hear it now, above the wind, above the whispers, something moving, something behind me. I didn't have to look to know what it was. I could feel it, creeping closer, its breath cold and foul on my neck. You can't escape. We are everywhere. We are the wind. The darkness swallowed me whole. The next morning, I woke up in the same spot. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavier, as if something had changed. The house was still standing. The trees outside had stopped swaying, the wind's gone. But it didn't feel like the same world. It didn't feel like the same place. I got up, trembling, my mind too disoriented to process what had happened. The whispers, no, the voices, had stopped, but I knew they hadn't left. They were still there, buried deep in the wind, waiting. And somewhere in that wind, I could still hear their call. It's not over, Ethan. You've only just begun to listen. The silence that followed the storm was deafening. The house, once my sanctuary, felt alien, as if it no longer belonged to me. I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the door that had once burst open with such force. It was now gently closed, but it didn't feel like it belonged there anymore. The air felt heavy with a presence that was almost suffocating. I glanced out the window. The sky was clear, the trees standing still in the gentle light of the morning sun. It should have been a relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Waiting. I shook my head, trying to force myself to focus. I needed to get control of myself. I couldn't let the storm or the whispers rule my life. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. I went outside, determined to face whatever it was head on. The ground was still damp from the storm, the earth soft beneath my boots. I walked toward the edge of the forest, the place where I had heard the whispers for the first time. The wind was calm now, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached the clearing where the trees opened up to reveal the full stretch of the forest. It looked peaceful, serene even, but I knew better now. I knew that beneath the stillness, something was wrong. The wind picked up again, not the gentle breeze I was used to, but something stronger, more insistent. It began to swirl around me, tugging at my clothes, pulling at my hair. And then I heard it. You shouldn't be here. I froze, the voice clear and cold in the air. It was the same voice I had heard the night before. The whispers had become more distinct, more confident. They were no longer just warning me, they were threatening me. I spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the wind calm once more. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in my chest. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it felt like it was right beside me. I was alone in the forest, and yet I wasn't alone. Leave, or stay and face the consequences. I couldn't tell if the voice was real or if it was just a product of my fraying sanity. But it didn't matter. I knew I had no choice. I had to keep moving forward, had to find out what was behind all of this. If I ran now, I would never stop running. The wind would follow me, the whispers would follow me, and I would be lost forever in their grasp. I took a deep breath and stepped further into the forest, my feet crunching on the wet leaves beneath me. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, shadows stretching long across the ground. The path was narrow, barely visible, but I had to follow it. I had to see this through. The wind whispered again, louder this time. "You're too late." A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was the cold or fear, but it didn't matter. The words were like a cold hand gripping my heart, pulling me deeper into the woods. I pressed on, my legs aching with every step, the sense of dread growing heavier with each passing moment. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me. The path that had once seemed familiar now felt foreign, alien, like the forest itself was shifting, reshaping, reacting to my every move. I could no longer tell where the path ended and where the forest began. The wind swirled again, this time in a frenzy, and I could hear something moving through the trees. A rustling, like footsteps, but not quite right, too heavy, too uneven. "It knows you're here. It's coming." I stopped dead in my tracks, the voice so close I could feel it in my bones. My heart thudded in my chest as the realization hit me. The wind wasn't just a messenger. It was a force, a creature, alive and aware, and it had been watching me all along. I wasn't just hearing whispers, I was being hunted. I turned, but the trees were now closing in on me from all sides. The path I had followed had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. I had no idea where I was anymore. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was lost, trapped in a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare no longer existed. The rustling grew louder, closer. It was no longer the wind, but something more tangible, something moving in the shadows. There's nowhere to run. I spun around, but there was no escape. The air was thick with the wind, heavy with a presence that seemed to press against me from all sides. I could hear the leaves crunching beneath footsteps that weren't mine, and I knew I wasn't alone. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went quiet. The rustling stopped, the wind died down, and I was left in an eerie stillness. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear anything that could explain what was happening. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. It was coming from the trees, from deep within the forest, something primal and terrifying. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a warning like no other. It's not over. You've just begun to understand. The wind picked up again, swirling violently around me, but this time it wasn't just the wind. I could feel something else, something cold and ancient, moving within the air. I could feel it breathing, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. I had to get out of here. I had to survive. But the forest was alive, and it was coming for me. I ran. There was no plan, no strategy, just pure instinct pushing me forward. My legs burned as I stumbled through the dense forest, branches scratching at my face, roots tangling around my feet. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, but I could feel them. They were in the air, in the ground beneath me, in the very atmosphere. The wind had become a force, a howling, biting beast chasing me through the trees, its voice a constant presence in my mind. You cannot escape. You will never escape. I pushed on, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. But I knew deep down I was running towards something, not away from it. The deeper I ran into the forest, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to warp and twist around me, their branches contorting into unnatural shapes. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to my every step. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if the earth was shifting beneath my feet. The further I went, the harder it became to breathe, the weight of the air pressing down on me like a thick blanket. I stumbled, my foot catching on a hidden root, and I fell to the ground with a grunt. My palms scraped against the rough, wet earth as I pushed myself back up. The wind roared around me, its howls growing louder, angrier. And I could hear it again, that low, menacing growl coming from somewhere behind me. You're not fast enough. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew what was chasing me, even if I couldn't see it. The presence in the wind was all-consuming, its force pushing against me, urging me to keep running. But it wasn't just the wind anymore, it was something more, something darker, something that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows. I ran faster, my breath sharp and shallow. The trees were closing in, the path narrowing until I could barely squeeze through. Every direction seemed to lead me deeper into the forest, into a place where the air grew colder, where the whispers became louder, more insistent. You cannot hide from it. It knows you now. I felt the ground tremble beneath me, the earth shifting as if something enormous was moving beneath the surface. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The growl was louder now, closer, and I knew that whatever it was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder for the first time, my eyes frantically scanning the forest. There was nothing there, nothing visible, at least. But the wind had taken on a new quality, almost as if it were alive, moving with purpose, searching for me. I felt it brush against my skin, cold and sharp like 1,000 icy fingers. The forest had become a maze, a trap, and I was its prey. It's too late. You belong to the wind now. The voice was right in my ear, louder than it had ever been. I spun around again, but there was nothing there, just the endless, oppressive darkness of the forest. My mind was racing, my body screaming for rest, for safety, for an escape that I knew would never come. I could feel the wind pushing against me, as if trying to force me in a specific direction. But it wasn't just the wind anymore. The air was thick with something else, something that felt like it was creeping inside me, twisting my thoughts, feeding on my fear. I stumbled again, this time crashing into a tree, my body slamming against its rough bark. My vision blurred, and for a moment everything went silent. The wind had stopped. The growling had stopped. The whispers had stopped. And in the sudden, eerie silence, I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable. You can't run forever. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. It wasn't coming from the wind this time. It was coming from the trees, from the very earth beneath me. I looked down, and for the first time, I saw it. The ground had begun to shift, the soil moving in ripples, like something was pushing its way up from beneath the surface. The wind started again, but now it wasn't just the wind. It was the voice, and the earth, and the very forest itself, all speaking in unison, all telling me the same thing. You belong to the wind. You can never escape. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen, my body paralyzed by a fear so intense it was like ice running through my veins. I could feel the ground tremble beneath me again, this time more violently, and the earth split open, wide enough to swallow me whole. The shadow emerged from the ground, massive and terrifying, its form a writhing mass of darkness, swirling with the winds. It towered over me, its presence suffocating, crushing the very air around me. The wind howled, its voice now a deafening roar, and I could hear it clearly, louder than ever before. You are mine now, Ethan, and you will never leave. The shadow's form stretched, wrapping around me like a shroud, its tendrils coiling through the air, pulling me toward it. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, caught in the web of the wind, the forest, the creature that had been waiting for me all along. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent again. The shadow was gone. The wind had stopped. The ground was still. I opened my eyes, unsure of how much time had passed. I was lying on the ground, my body aching, my mind spinning. Had it been real? Had I truly seen the shadow, felt its presence? Or had it all been some twisted hallucination brought on by fear, exhaustion, and the relentless whispers of the wind? But when I looked up, I saw it. The sky was darkening again, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. And in the distance, I could hear it, the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. The wind was picking up once more, and I knew it wasn't over. I had only just begun to understand the terrible truth. The wind was alive, and it was coming for me. I thought I had escaped the hunt, but the forest had other plans. The wind was always there, always just behind me, its voice now a constant presence in my mind. It wasn't a storm, a weather pattern, or a simple breeze. It was a force, an ancient, malevolent entity that had been waiting for me. And now it had found me. The whispers were louder than ever before, suffocating me, pushing me to the brink of madness. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a sentence. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. You belong to the wind. I knew the truth now. There was no escaping it. The wind had claimed me, and there was no turning back. The forest seemed to pulse with life. Every tree, every leaf, every gust of wind was a part of it now. I could feel it. The whispers, the voices, the pressure in the air, it was all around me, wrapping me in a suffocating grip. The wind had become my constant companion, its voice always in my ear, whispering, beckoning, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I stumbled forward, my legs barely able to carry me, my mind a haze of fear and confusion. The forest had changed since I first entered. It wasn't just trees and paths anymore, it was a living, breathing thing, its branches stretching out like dark, skeletal fingers, grasping for me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I could see none. I could feel it watching, listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. It's too late. The voice was clearer now, its tone almost sadistic. The wind whipped around me with renewed force, tugging at my clothes, at my hair, urging me to keep moving. But where? I had no direction left. No purpose. I was running in circles, lost in a maze that seemed to shift and twist every time I blinked. There is no escape. I screamed into the wind, my voice swallowed by the howling gusts. But it didn't matter. I knew it would never answer. The wind had no interest in dialogue. It had no interest in mercy. It was an entity of hunger, a force of nature that fed on fear, on isolation, on despair. And I had been its prey from the very beginning. You belonged to the wind. The voice wasn't just in the wind now. It was in the ground beneath me. It was in the trees, in the rustling leaves, in the very air I breathed. The world itself had become a part of it, and I was trapped in its endless grasp. I kept moving. There was nothing else I could do. I couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't think. I had to keep going, keep moving, or the wind would consume me completely. And then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, shrouded in shadows. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew that it was waiting for me. Come to me. The voice wasn't coming from the wind now. It was coming from the figure, deep, powerful, and filled with authority. I hesitated, my body frozen in fear, but something inside me pushed me forward. Maybe it was the sheer weight of everything I had endured. Maybe it was the knowledge that this was the end. But I took a step toward it. The figure raised its hand, and the wind howled louder, as if it had been summoned. The air grew cold, biting, and I could feel its grip tightening around me, pulling me toward the shadowy figure. When I reached it, the figure finally spoke. You have come far, Ethan. I froze at the sound of my name. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was smooth, like the wind itself, but there was a sharpness to it now, something ancient and cold. You should have turned back. I shook my head, my mind reeling. What are you? I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It stepped forward, and I felt the wind intensify, as though it was circling around us. It was no longer just a breeze, it was alive, roaring with power, ready to consume everything. You've learned too much, the figure said, its voice dark and final. The wind is not just a storm. It is a force of nature, a spirit, a being that has existed for as long as the earth has turned. And now, it has claimed you. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to fight, to tear myself away from this presence. But my legs wouldn't move. The wind had me now, and I was helpless in its grasp. It will never end, the figure continued, its hands still outstretched. The whispers will always be with you. The wind will always be there, carrying your name. It knows you, Ethan. And you know it. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the suffocating pressure of its presence. The wind screamed around me, the voices melding together in a crescendo that felt like it was tearing my mind apart. I could feel the weight of the forest closing in, the earth beneath me shifting, and I knew this was it. This was the end. I opened my eyes again, and everything had changed. The figure was gone. The wind had stopped. The forest was still. But the feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if the forest itself had turned its gaze upon me, aware of my every move. You belong to the wind now. I turned, and the familiar voice of the wind whispered in my ear, louder now, clearer than ever before. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, a force that had woven itself into my very being. It was a part of me now. I didn't know if I was still in the forest or if I had somehow crossed into another realm, but the truth was undeniable. The wind had claimed me. And as I stood there, caught between the earth and the sky, I realized that there was no escape. No salvation. I was forever bound to the wind, its whispers always with me, following me wherever I went. And I would never be free. Do you believe in things that shouldn't exist? That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stared at the door in front of me. It was strange how quickly the feeling crept up on me, how easily I dismissed it at first. But now, as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this apartment, this place, was wrong. The building I had moved into was old. Not just old in age, but old in the way that makes you question its history. The kind of building where the walls whisper secrets you can never quite make out, and the floors creak as if remembering things that have long been forgotten. I had seen the listing online, a seemingly ordinary apartment in a forgotten part of the city. The rent was cheap, which was a rarity in this area. There was something almost too convenient about it. But I needed a place to stay, and the deal was too good to pass up. The agent was a friendly, albeit distracted, man who handed me the keys with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's a bit unusual," he had said, "but it's fine. It's perfectly safe. Don't worry about the number 13. Some things are better left unexplained." He had said it in a way that suggested he was trying to reassure me, but instead, it made me even more uneasy. I had dismissed it. After all, it was just an apartment. Except, when I arrived at the building, something didn't seem right. The layout of the building didn't match what I had been told. The floor plan was strange, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't find an apartment with the number 13. There was no door labeled 13, no hallway leading to it. Just the other apartments, all properly numbered in sequence, with no trace of the supposed 13th. Yet, when I reached the elevator and pressed the button for the 12th floor, I noticed something odd. The button for the 13th floor was there. And just above it, the small metal plate with a faded number, 13, barely visible. I hadn't been paying much attention to it before, but now that I was standing in front of it, it seemed out of place. The elevator doors opened with a soft whir, and I stepped out onto the floor. To my surprise, there was no immediate sign of the apartment I was supposed to be renting. Just a long, dimly lit hallway with doors on either side. The walls looked old, worn, but not in the way that they would be if this were simply an aging building. No, this felt different. More worn than the rest of the building. I walked down the hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. It wasn't until I reached the very end of the hall that I found it. Apartment number 13. I stopped, staring at the door. The numbers were faded, chipped. The wood on the door was warped and cracked. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, making me cough. But it was there. And the strange thing was, it felt like it shouldn't be. I pulled out the keys, hesitated for a moment, and unlocked the door. Inside, the apartment was exactly what I expected, empty, a little run down, but serviceable. It had the same creaky floorboards, the same peeling wallpaper, the same air of disrepair. But what struck me immediately was the silence. The silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the very space itself was holding its breath. As I explored the apartment, something caught my eye. A strange, old photograph was tucked into the corner of one of the shelves. It was black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of a building. They were smiling, looking happy, as if they had just moved in, just like me. But as I looked closer, something made my skin crawl. In the photograph, there was a man standing off to the side. He was blurry, out of focus, almost as if he didn't belong. But there was something about his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, staring directly at the camera, but more than that, it felt like they were staring at me. I quickly shoved the photo back onto the shelf, as though it was something I shouldn't have seen. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as I moved through the apartment. The silence was unnerving, but I figured it was just the result of the building's age. The same creaks, the same whispers. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something lingering just beyond my perception. I was about to sit down when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere deep in the walls. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but as I listened closer, it sounded deliberate. Slow, rhythmic. Almost like something or someone was trying to get out. I stood frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching continued for several long moments before stopping as suddenly as it had started. I shook my head. It was nothing. The building was old, and buildings make noises. I was just tired. But as the evening wore on, the noises became more frequent. The wind picked up, howling outside the apartment. Every now and then, I would hear soft whispers in the wind, as though voices were floating just outside my window, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. The feeling that this apartment wasn't empty, that it had a history, a past that it wasn't ready to let go of. It wasn't until much later that night, as I lay in bed, that I realized something chilling. The apartment number was wrong. There was no 13 in the building. And yet, I was here, in apartment number 13, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay any longer. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The apartment felt suffocating, like it was closing in around me. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the soft scratching sounds coming from somewhere in the walls, like the building itself was breathing. At times, I would hear what seemed like faint whispers, just out of reach, drifting in from the hallway or the window, but when I tried to focus on them, they'd stop, as if mocking me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Old buildings have quirks. Noises. It's natural. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in this place was wrong. I had to admit it. The more I stayed in this apartment, the more it felt like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I woke the next morning, my sleep fractured and uneasy. The daylight didn't seem to help. It only seemed to make the apartment feel colder, like the light wasn't reaching into all the corners. After a quick shower, I grabbed my keys and decided to get out for a while, take a walk, clear my head. As I opened the door, I noticed something odd. The hallway looked different. The shadows seemed longer, stretching across the floor like they were trying to reach me. The air was still. I paused, staring down the hallway. The apartment across from mine had its door slightly ajar. I had never noticed that before. It was just a crack, barely enough for someone to peer inside, but it made my skin crawl. I hadn't seen anyone in the building since I moved in, and I certainly hadn't seen anyone come or go from that apartment. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked slowly toward the open door. As I reached out to push it open, the door creaked, and the air inside seemed to press against me. It was cold, too cold, like a breath held for far too long. Inside, the apartment looked empty. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, but the atmosphere was heavy, like something had been left behind. The strange thing was, the apartment appeared exactly like mine, same layout, same faded wallpaper, same creaky floors. But the air here felt different. It felt like something was lingering in the silence. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. My mind kept racing back to the photograph I had found in my own apartment, the blurry man in the background. The man who had been staring at me through the lens. I couldn't shake the thought that he had lived here. That somehow, this apartment was part of a larger story, one I didn't fully understand. A soft scuffling sound made me freeze. My heart skipped a beat as I turned quickly toward the far corner of the room. There was nothing there, but I swore I saw a shadow flicker, just for a split second, like something or someone had moved. I stepped back, my mind telling me to leave, to get out of there before I lost my grip on reality. But then, as I reached the door, I saw it, on the far wall, near the window. A message had been scratched into the peeling wallpaper. It wasn't clear at first, just a jumble of lines and shapes, but as I stared harder, the letters began to form into words. They never left. I didn't need to look further. The message hit me like a punch in the gut. Who had written it? And why? Was it from the previous tenants? Or was it someone else trying to tell me something? I backed away from the wall, my pulse racing. The air seemed to grow colder as I turned to leave, and as I reached for the door, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing just behind me. I whipped around, but again, the apartment was empty. Still. But the air had shifted. It was as if something was there now, something that hadn't been before. I could feel it pressing in on me, like the walls were closing in, suffocating me with their silence. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. I stumbled into the hallway and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking. What was going on? The building was clearly hiding something, but what? And why did it feel like I was being drawn deeper into its mysteries with each passing day? Back in my apartment, I tried to push the thoughts away, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I needed to know more about the apartment, the previous tenants, the history of this place. I had to figure out what was happening before it consumed me completely. But first, I had to find out why apartment number 13 didn't exist on the floor plan, why it was never supposed to be there. I grabbed my phone and called the building's management office. The same agent picked up, his voice oddly cheerful. "Hello, this is Mark. How can I help you today?" "Mark, I have a question," I began, trying to steady my voice. "I'm in apartment number 13, and..." He cut me off. "I'm sorry, but there is no apartment number 13, he said, his tone suddenly sharp. "You must be mistaken. There's only 12 apartments on this floor. Number 13. I felt a chill run down my spine. "But it's right here. I'm in it. It's at the end of the hall." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Listen, it's best you leave that apartment. The sooner, the better. Trust me." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. The words echoed in my mind, "Leave that apartment." But how could I? I was already here. And something told me that leaving might not be as simple as just walking out the door. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay. The apartment felt like it was watching me now, its walls pressing in closer every time I turned around. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to the previous tenants wasn't over. It hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The following days dragged on, each one blending into the next like an endless stretch of gray. I spent most of my time at home, restless, trying to ignore the strange feeling that gnawed at me from every corner of the apartment. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, just my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I looked around, it felt like the apartment was watching me back. The whispers, though faint, were constant. I tried to convince myself that they were just the wind or perhaps the old pipes groaning under the weight of the building. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The sounds were random. They had a rhythm to them. They came at night, always the same time, right before midnight. I couldn't sleep anymore. I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the soft scratch of the whispers to start. Sometimes I would get up, unable to bear it any longer, and wander around the apartment, hoping the sound would stop. But no matter where I went, it followed me. The air seemed thicker in certain rooms, more oppressive. It was like the walls were closing in, suffocating me with every breath. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what had happened to the previous tenants. I needed answers. But every time I tried to look into the history of the apartment, there was nothing. No records. No past. Just a blank space. It was as if apartment number 13 had never existed, like it had been erased from time itself. One afternoon, I decided to visit the building's manager, hoping to get more information. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the building was hiding the truth from me. The manager, Mark, was waiting for me in his small, cluttered office. As soon as I stepped inside, he looked up at me with a strange, unreadable expression. "Did you leave the apartment?" he asked, his voice low and almost too calm. I hesitated before answering. "No, I haven't left. But I need to know what's going on here. Why does apartment number 13 exist if it's not supposed to?" Mark sighed, rubbing his temples as though he were trying to keep his patience in check. "You don't understand," he said, his voice growing quieter. "You need to leave it alone. You're better off not knowing." I leaned forward, pressing him. Who lived there before me? Why did they leave? Or did they leave? For a moment, Mark didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his eyes tired and defeated, like he had been expecting this conversation. Finally, he spoke. "They didn't leave. They disappeared." I froze. "Disappeared?" I repeated, not quite believing my own ears. Mark nodded slowly. "I don't know what happened, exactly. But it's not the first time. There's something about that apartment, something that doesn't want people there. Some people think it's cursed. Others think it's just a freak coincidence, but I don't know. I've seen too many people come and go, only for them to vanish without a trace." His voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes now. Fear that matched mine. Something wasn't right, and Mark knew it. "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice rising in anger. "Why didn't you warn me?" Mark's face hardened. "I tried. People don't listen. You're not the first to ask questions. But you're the first to stay. That apartment doesn't let people leave. And it doesn't let people forget." I left his office in a daze, my mind reeling. Disappeared? What did that even mean? And why had I stayed, knowing this? Was I being drawn into something I couldn't escape? When I returned to apartment number 13, it felt different. The air was thick with tension. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, as if the apartment itself was reacting to the conversation I'd just had. It felt alive, aware of me. I decided to search the apartment more thoroughly, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the mysteries surrounding it. I started in the bedroom, moving the old furniture, checking every nook and cranny. As I was rummaging through a closet, something caught my eye. A small, faded photograph stuck behind a loose panel in the wall. I pulled it out carefully, and as I gazed at the image, a chill ran down my spine. It was a picture of a family, 2 parents and a small child. But what disturbed me most wasn't the family itself. It was the date written on the back. August 13th, 1997. The date sent a shiver through me. It was the same date I had moved into the apartment. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the coincidence felt too perfect. I could almost feel the presence of the family in the room, watching me. I flipped the photo over again, trying to see if there was any clue to their fate, but the writing was smudged and unclear. My hand trembled as I placed it back into the wall and covered the hole. Something told me I shouldn't go any further. As I walked back into the living room, I heard the whispering again, louder now, almost like it was speaking directly to me. The words were clear this time, unmistakable. "You're next." I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one there. Just the empty apartment, the silent walls. But the air was thick with an unseen presence. Something, or someone, was waiting for me to make the next move. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. The apartment wasn't just a place. It was a force, a living thing, and it was drawing me in, pulling me deeper with every passing moment. And there was no way out. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, but it lingered in the back of my mind, a constant pressure I couldn't escape. The whispers in the apartment grew more insistent, more frequent, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. It was as though they were woven into the very fabric of the walls, seeping through the cracks and crevices, filling the space with their sinister murmurs. At night, I would lie in bed, staring into the dark, listening as the sounds began. Soft at first, rustling, like something shifting in the shadows. But then the whispers would grow louder, more distinct, carrying with them a sense of impending doom. The words were never clear at first, but as I strained to hear them, they started to form into sentences. "Come closer. It's waiting. You belong here." I tried to block it out, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but it felt too real. Every night, the air grew heavier, as if the apartment was alive, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The worst part was that the sounds didn't stop when I tried to leave the room. They followed me, whispering from every corner, from behind the curtains, under the floorboards. There was no escape. It felt like the apartment itself was wrapping around me, trapping me in its embrace. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth, no matter what the cost. Mark had warned me, but I was beyond listening to warnings now. I had to confront whatever haunted this place. I couldn't just leave. There was something pulling me in, something tying me to this apartment, something I couldn't name. The next morning, I visited the building's records office again, hoping to find more information on the family in the photograph, anything that could explain their disappearance. This time, the clerk was more cooperative. She led me to a dusty old filing cabinet, its metal drawers creaking as she opened one. "There's something odd about this place," she said quietly, as though she were afraid someone might overhear. "No one really talks about apartment number 13. It's like people forget about it. We've had several tenants in there over the years, but none of them stay for long." She handed me a folder with a few old documents. As I flipped through them, my heart skipped a beat. There, written in faded ink, was the name of the family from the photograph. The names were familiar now, the Daltons. The parents, Nathan and Elizabeth, and their child, Emma. The file contained some basic details, but it was what was missing that caught my eye. There was no record of their disappearance, no police reports, no investigation. It was like they had never existed. The clerk hesitated, then added, there was a rumor years ago. Some said the Daltons weren't the only ones to disappear from that apartment. It's like the building's trying to erase them from memory. I don't know how, but I've seen it happen before. People leave, and when they do, it's like they were never here. I stared at the folder in disbelief. The words swam before my eyes as the clerk's voice seemed to fade into the background. Something about the building, something about apartment number 13, was far darker than I had ever imagined. I had to get to the bottom of it, but now, more than ever, I feared what I might find. As I left the records office, the weight of what I'd learned settled heavily on my chest. The whispers had returned, louder now, as though the apartment itself was aware of my discovery. My footsteps echoed in the empty hall as I made my way back to apartment number 13. When I entered the apartment, the atmosphere was thick, oppressive. The walls felt closer, the air seemed heavier. The whispers were louder, and now they were no longer just words. I could hear them shift and change, like a voice trying to form into something real. I could feel the apartment drawing me in, pulling me deeper into its dark embrace. I went to the living room, unable to resist the pull. The shadows there seemed deeper, thicker, as though something was hiding in the dark. I had to know what was waiting for me. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked toward the window, hoping for some sign, some clue that would explain all this. But then I froze. The window wasn't what I remembered. There was something different about it. The view outside had changed. The familiar skyline of the city was gone, replaced by a dark, twisted forest stretching into an endless void. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at the sky. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around. The apartment had changed. The walls were no longer the same. The furniture was different, older, worn down, as if it had been here for decades or even longer. I could hear the whispers more clearly now, like 100 voices speaking in unison. It's time. It's time to join us. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though the apartment itself was alive, consuming everything around it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the fear was overwhelming. The apartment was no longer just a place, it was something else. Something dark, something ancient. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the door wouldn't open. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled every corner of the apartment. I could hear them even in my mind now, as if they were inside me, pushing me toward the edge of madness. Join us. I looked around in desperation, but there was no escape. No way out. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the shadows, a figure stood. Its shape was blurry at first, but as it stepped forward, it became clearer. It was a person, a woman, or something that once was. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, like she had been lost to time itself. She reached out a hand toward me, and I felt the pull. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing colder. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, the figure spoke, her voice a whisper, barely audible above the others. You're one of us now. The words sent a chill through my body, and for the first time, I realized the truth. The apartment wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had claimed me. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the figure's words crushed me, forcing every inch of air from my lungs. I stumbled backward, but the apartment seemed to grow tighter with every step. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. One of us now. Her voice echoed in my head, a mocking chant that reverberated through my thoughts. The figure, if it could still be called a figure, was moving closer, its hands still outstretched, her hollow eyes locked on mine. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. The room was shifting around me, warping like a mirage in a desert. Nothing was real anymore. The walls twisted and groaned as though they were breathing, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent, like a choir of souls crying out in agony. I forced myself to move, to break free from the trance that had gripped me. But the air had turned thick and oppressive, like walking through water, and with every movement, the shadows seemed to pull me back. The figure didn't move quickly, but there was something chilling about the way it advanced, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I couldn't escape. "You can't run. This place won't let you." The voice wasn't just hers anymore. It was the apartment speaking, its voice a thousand whispers entwined together, each one carrying its own anguish and torment. It had known from the beginning that I was never meant to leave. I could feel it now, the truth sinking into my bones like a cold, unshakable weight. The apartment wasn't just a place. It was something older, something malignant that thrived on fear and isolation. The Daltons hadn't disappeared, they had been absorbed into the walls, consumed by the very fabric of this place. And now, I was its next victim. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but my hand froze just before I reached the handle. The apartment wasn't done with me yet. The door wouldn't open. It had never been a door that could open. It was a barrier, a threshold I had crossed without even knowing it. The whispers intensified, now an overwhelming storm of sound that rattled my mind. I looked desperately around the room, trying to find some clue, some way to fight back, but it was all futile. The walls closed in, the shadows thickened, and the figure in the corner took another step forward. I saw the shape more clearly now, a pale, gaunt woman, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Her eyes were vacant, as though the light had been sucked out of her soul. She was one of them, one of the lost souls that the apartment had devoured. And I was becoming like her. "You'll stay with us, just like the others," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible against the rising cacophony of whispers. I stumbled backward, my mind unraveling. The apartment was closing in on me, suffocating me, and in that moment, I understood. The door, the window, everything that had once been normal, it was all part of the trap. There was no way out. There never had been. I screamed, but my voice was lost in the clamor of the apartment, swallowed whole by the walls, the floors, and the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, freezing my breath in the air as the shadows deepened. And then I saw it, the final revelation. Behind the figure, a mirror had appeared on the wall, one that hadn't been there before. I couldn't look away from it. In the reflection, I saw myself, but I wasn't alone. Standing behind me was a crowd, figures from the past, people who had vanished, people who had lived in the apartment before me. They were all staring at me, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in terror. And in the center of them all, standing tall, was the Dalton family, the parents, Nathan and Elizabeth, and their daughter Emma. They were all looking at me with the same expression. Their mouths moved, but the words were drowned out by the rising storm of whispers around me. The apartment had consumed them all, and now I was the last one. I turned away from the mirror, desperate to escape the nightmare, but the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The apartment was alive. It was feeding off my fear, pulling me in, and there was no way to break free. Join us. You belong here. The words echoed in my mind as the shadows closed in around me. I tried to fight, to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence. The apartment had won. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me. And then, with one final breath, everything went black. Have you ever found yourself driving down a road you know well, and yet, somehow, it feels different? As if the path before you has changed in subtle ways, but you can't quite put your finger on why? That night, on the road, I felt it. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a presence, an invisible force that twisted my gut and made my hands tighten around the wheel. It was a dark, clear evening when I set off. The kind of night that feels empty, as if the world is holding its breath. I was driving alone, as I often did on these lonely roads, with only the sound of tires on the asphalt to break the silence. The headlights cut through the blackness ahead, but even they seemed weak, swallowed by the vastness of the night. I had taken this same route countless times before, but tonight, the world seemed different. As I drove further, a fog began to creep in from the sides of the road. At first, it was subtle, just a light mist, barely noticeable. But then, as if responding to some unseen signal, it grew thicker, faster, rolling in like a living thing. The kind of fog that swallows sound, dampens your senses, and makes every turn feel like a step into the unknown. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. I was used to the quiet, but tonight the silence felt heavy, pressing in on me. I tried to shake the unease gnawing in my mind, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the fog thickening with each passing minute. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. It had been miles, maybe longer. My phone had no signal out here, not that it mattered. The road was always empty at night, quiet and forgotten. But tonight, the emptiness felt wrong. It felt watched. I reached a familiar curve in the road, the one that led me into a small stretch of woods. It was always eerie at night, but tonight, the trees seemed to loom darker than usual, their shapes twisted and indistinct in the fog. The headlights barely penetrated the mist, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally, as though the forest itself was alive, watching me. I slowed the car as I rounded the corner. Something felt off. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and I could feel the weight of the fog pressing against the car like a wall. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was swallowed by the mist, as though nothing existed beyond the few feet illuminated by my headlights. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a figure, a shape, standing at the edge of the road. A person, or at least, that's what I thought it was. But as I drew closer, the figure didn't move. It stood still, completely still, as if it had been waiting for me. It didn't seem to have a face, just a dark, formless shape that bled into the fog, blending with the night. I froze, my foot pressing hard on the brake. I tried to look away, but my eyes couldn't leave it. I was paralyzed, my breath caught in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. A flash of panic surged through me. Was it a person in need of help? Or something else entirely? My instinct screamed at me to drive on, to avoid whatever this thing was. But I couldn't. Something held me there, a feeling I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath and slowly eased off the brake. I had to keep moving. I had to leave this place. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I carefully accelerated, my eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. But just as I thought I had passed the figure, I saw something I hadn't expected. The figure was moving now, but not in the way a person would. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, as though the fog itself was carrying it forward, shifting and contorting like a shadow in motion. And then, as the fog thickened even more, the figure vanished from my view, disappearing into the dense mist. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to steady myself, but the fear was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. Was I imagining things? Had I really seen something, or had the fog played tricks on my mind? I focused on the road ahead, trying to push the thoughts from my mind, but the fog seemed to be growing even denser. The air felt cold now, uncomfortably so. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I saw something else. A light. A soft glow flickering in the distance, barely visible through the thick fog. I squinted, my eyes straining to make out what it was. Another car? A house? The light was dim, far away, but it seemed to beckon me. Without thinking, I turned the wheel, steering the car toward the light. The road ahead twisted and curved, and the fog closed in tighter. My headlights barely illuminated anything beyond a few feet. The light grew brighter, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't like the light from a house or a street lamp. It was different, almost unnatural. As I drove closer, the fog parted slightly, revealing what was beyond. It wasn't a house or a car. It was a sign. A road sign, bent and rusted, as if it had been here for years, abandoned and forgotten. But that wasn't the strangest part. The sign read, "Turn back." I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The fog closed in faster now, enveloping the car completely, and the road sign faded from view. In that instant, I knew I had made a mistake. I was lost. And worse, something was following me. Something that knew I couldn't escape. The silence returned, but it was different now. Heavier. More suffocating. I had taken the wrong turn, and now I was trapped. I sat frozen in the car, my eyes darting back and forth between the rearview mirror and the dense fog surrounding me. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and my palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was an impenetrable void, swallowed by the mist. The turn back sign had disappeared, and with it, any sense of direction. What had I done? I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. There was no sign of life, no other light, just the cold, oppressive fog pressing against my windows, like it was trying to push me deeper into whatever nightmare lay ahead. I should have turned around. I should have ignored that light, that strange, beckoning glow. But now, the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, as if I had no choice but to move forward. Something told me that if I stayed here, trapped in this swirling fog, I would never leave. My headlights flickered. Once, twice, then stayed steady again. I let out a relieved sigh, but the moment of calm didn't last. The air in the car had turned frigid, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the side of my vehicle. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like fingernails dragging across metal. I jerked my head toward the window, but there was nothing there. Only the fog. Yet, the sound continued, scrape, scrape, closer, as if whatever was out there was pacing me, waiting. I put the car in gear, my foot heavy on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, but the fog seemed to thicken in response, swirling around the car as if it were alive. Every turn I made was met with the same suffocating embrace. The road ahead was still invisible, and the only thing I could trust was the dim light of my headlights. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead. It wasn't a person, at least, not in the way I understood people. It was a dark silhouette, its shape shifting as though made of the fog itself. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the car didn't respond as quickly as it should have. It was like the road beneath me had grown slick, resisting my every move. The figure loomed ahead, its outline faintly glowing, but there was no detail to its form. It didn't have a face. It didn't have arms or legs. It was just there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat creeping down my back. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. My mind screamed at me to drive forward, to break through whatever this was. I had to keep going. I had to escape. But as I pressed harder on the gas, the car seemed to slow, as if the fog itself was pulling me back. The figure, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. Then, I heard it. A whisper. It came from all around me, the faintest of sounds, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't words at first, just a breathy, low hum that echoed in the fog. But then, the hum grew clearer, more defined, and I began to make out the words. Turn back. The voice was distant, but it was undeniably real, and it made my blood run cold. I glanced around, my eyes darting over the rearview mirror, the side windows, and the fog outside. There was nothing. No one. I was alone. The whisper came again, louder now. Turn back, or you will never escape. I didn't know if it was the fog playing tricks on my mind or if it was something else, something far worse, but the terror that gripped me was undeniable. Every instinct I had told me to turn the car around, to drive away from whatever this was. But every time I tried, the fog thickened even more, narrowing my path, forcing me to keep moving forward. I had no choice. With one last, desperate push, I accelerated, the car surging forward. The figure ahead wavered for a moment, then disappeared into the fog, but I didn't feel any safer. The whispers continued, growing louder, as if they were closing in around me. I needed to get out of here. I had to find a way to break free from the fog's hold. But the deeper I went, the more the road twisted, as though it were shifting, rearranging itself. The path that should have been familiar was now unrecognizable. I tried to slow down, but the car seemed to have a mind of its own, pulling me forward, dragging me deeper into the mist. My mind was racing, spinning with confusion and fear. What was happening? Where was I? What was this place? Then, out of nowhere, the car jolted forward, and the steering wheel jerked to the side. The tires screeched as the car veered off course, sending me into a sharp curve. My heart skipped a beat as I struggled to regain control, but it was too late. I was headed straight for the trees. I tried to steer back onto the road, but the fog made everything impossible to see. The world outside was a blur of white and gray, and the only thing I could focus on was the sound of the engine revving, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Then came the impact. The car slammed into something hard, something solid. The world spun, and for a moment, I was disoriented, unable to tell up from down. The headlights flickered, then went dark. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. The fog pressed against the car like a living thing, its tendrils curling around the broken vehicle. I could hear the whispers again, closer now, as if they were right outside the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat there, frozen in fear. I had to get out. I had to leave this place. But as I opened the door, I saw it. There, standing just outside, was the figure once more. This time, it wasn't made of fog. It was solid, real, and it was looking at me. "Turn back," it whispered, "or you'll never leave." I froze in place, the door still ajar, my heart hammering against my chest as the figure stared at me with an intensity that felt like it was burning through my soul. I couldn't breathe. My legs wouldn't move. It was as if my entire body had been paralyzed by the weight of its gaze. The fog had thickened, swirling around the figure like an ethereal cloak. It stood there, still as death, its form twisting slightly, as if the mist itself was part of its being. I could see no face, no eyes, but I felt its presence, felt it watching me, waiting. "Turn back," it repeated, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot, faint but insistent. My mind raced. I needed to move. I needed to get away from it. The whispers, the growing pressure in my chest, they were too much. I couldn't stay here. I turned back to the car, scrambling to get inside. But before I could close the door, the figure's hand, if you could call it that, reached toward me. It wasn't a hand at all. It was more like a long, shadowy tendril stretching out from the mist with a speed that defied its form. It touched my arm, and I gasped as a cold, clammy sensation crawled up my skin, seeping into my very bones. I yanked my arm back, stumbling into the car and slamming the door shut. The fog pressed against the windows, muffling the outside world, and the engine, still dead, did nothing to bring me back to the realm of safety I so desperately craved. My fingers fumbled with the keys, the metal cold against my skin as I tried to start the car again. Nothing. The engine refused to start. I turned the key again and again, each turn met with the same hollow click. I banged the steering wheel in frustration, my heart thumping in my throat. The whispers came again, this time louder and sharper. "Leave this place. You're not meant to be here." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. I had to escape. But how? The fog had already swallowed the road, turning the familiar landscape into an unrecognizable, nightmarish void. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of twisted loop, with no way out. I felt my stomach lurch as the car shifted slightly. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now that I was paying attention, I realized the ground beneath me was uneven. The car seemed to be shifting, slowly sinking into something. The once stable road had become soft, like wet earth, pulling the car further into its grasp. I panicked, grabbing the gear shift and trying to move the car, but the wheels only spun uselessly. I pushed my foot to the pedal, but there was no power, no response. The car was stuck. The fog pressed in from every side, blocking out any trace of light, any sense of orientation. I was utterly alone in the suffocating whiteness, and the whispers kept coming, louder, more frantic. "You're too far in now." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't escape. It was as if the fog itself had become alive, and I was its prey. There was nowhere to run, no way to hide. And then, I saw it. A figure appeared in the mist, at first, just a shadow, then more defined, taking shape as it moved toward me. A tall, imposing silhouette that seemed to ripple in and out of existence, flickering like a flame in the wind. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it approach. The figure's face, if you could call it that, was a hollow mask of gray, the features distorted and shifting as though made of the same mist that surrounded me. But there was something else in its gaze, something far more terrifying than any face could convey. It was as though it knew everything about me, everything I had ever done, every fear I had ever buried deep inside. "Why did you come here?" the figure asked, its voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate the air. "You were warned. Yet here you are, lost in the fog." I could barely speak, my throat tight with terror. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." It took a step forward, its form flickering with a haunting light. "You should have listened." And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished back into the mist, its presence fading like a bad dream. The air around me was still, eerily quiet, as if the world had gone to sleep. But the silence didn't comfort me, it only deepened the dread that clung to me like a second skin. I had to move. I had to leave. The whispers were growing louder now, a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words incoherent, blending into a maddening cacophony that echoed in my ears. I opened the car door, stepping out onto the soft, uneven ground. The fog was thicker here, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. But something pulled me forward, a compulsion, a need to follow the path laid out before me. The whispers urged me on, the ground shifting beneath my feet. I stumbled through the fog, each step uncertain, each breath shallow. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the voices, oh, the voices, they didn't stop. They told me things. Horrible things. Things that didn't make sense, but still, somehow, felt true. "You'll never find your way back. The road is lost. You are lost. Turn back before it's too late." I didn't know where I was going anymore. The fog had swallowed me whole, and the whispers surrounded me like a storm. The more I listened, the more I felt myself unraveling, as if the very fabric of my mind was beginning to come apart. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw it. A faint light, glowing in the distance, cutting through the fog. It was small, but it was something to cling to. My heart leaped in my chest as I started toward it, pushing my way through the mist with all the strength I could muster. But as I moved closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that the light wasn't getting any closer. It was standing still. And then it dawned on me, the light wasn't a beacon. It was a trap. A lure. And I was walking straight into it. The whispers grew louder. The ground beneath me trembled. Something was coming. I had made a mistake. And now, there would be no turning back. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the light, now eerily steady, hung just out of reach. It was no longer a welcoming glow. It was a warning. The whispers, now frantic, seemed to converge around me, urging me to retreat, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My body was frozen, caught in the gravity of the unknown. I had to turn away. I had to fight the pull of the fog, the voices, the light. But I couldn't move. Then, from the depths of the mist, I saw them, shadows, creeping toward me with unnatural speed. At first, they were nothing but fleeting forms, drifting in and out of my vision. But as they drew closer, I saw them for what they truly were, figures, but not quite human. Their limbs were long and twisted, stretching out in disturbing angles, their faces hidden beneath dark, hooded cloaks. The edges of their forms flickered like the mist itself, giving them an almost ghostly quality. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My throat was dry, choked by fear. My eyes darted back to the light, but it remained unmoving, the faint glow now twisted and distorted, like a sickly reflection in a shattered mirror. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate, its head tilting in a way that was far too unnatural. A thin, raspy voice echoed from beneath the hood. "You shouldn't have come." The words were soft, but they were laced with an undeniable threat. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling as the figure came closer. The shadow paused, as if considering the question, then responded in that same low, eerie tone. "We are what remains. We are what the fog demands." With each word it spoke, the air grew colder, the fog thickening around us, pressing in as though it had a mind of its own. I could feel its weight against my skin, and the sensation was suffocating. "What do you want from me?" I asked, backing away, my mind racing for an escape that seemed impossible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed toward the light. The others followed its motion, their eyes, if they could be called eyes, locked onto the same point. "The way forward," it whispered, "but not the way out." I glanced back at the light, which now seemed more like a distorted beacon of despair. It pulsed faintly, like the last heartbeat of something long dead, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot. The figure took another step toward me, its face still hidden. The others moved with it, their presence like a slow-moving tide that was about to consume me. They were all warned, the figure continued, its voice like a blade against my nerves. They ignored the signs, the path that was never meant to be walked. I was beginning to understand. The fog was not just a physical barrier, it was a force, an entity that existed beyond the rules of nature. It had claimed this road, claimed this path, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The figures that surrounded me were not just its inhabitants, they were its extensions, manifestations of the fog's will. I took a deep, shaky breath, steeling myself. "What happened to them?" I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. "The ones who came before." The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound like the creak of old wood. "They didn't listen. They didn't see the truth. And now they are part of the fog, lost forever." The other figures seemed to move closer, their shapes shifting and flickering in and out of existence. They were closing in on me, and there was no escape. No way forward. The fog was everywhere now, swallowing the road, the light, and all hope. Suddenly, I heard it, footsteps. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, but then unmistakable, growing louder as if someone was walking toward me from the other side of the fog. The figures froze, their attention shifting. I turned quickly, my eyes straining to see through the dense mist. Through the shifting shapes and flickering shadows, I saw a silhouette, a person. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Please, help me!" But the figure didn't respond. It just kept walking toward me, the footsteps echoing in the silence. The others, the shadows, began to move again, their hands reaching out, their whispers growing frantic. I was being surrounded. "No!" I shouted, panic flooding my veins. "Stay away from me!" The figure that was approaching me, the one I had hoped would be my savior, suddenly stopped. It wasn't a person at all. It was another shadow. A twisted, monstrous version of the others, its face distorted beyond recognition, its eyes empty pits of darkness. The figure extended its long, clawed hands toward me, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something. I stumbled, falling to the ground with a crash. My heart pounded as I tried to scramble away, but I was caught between the encroaching shadows and the ever-thickening fog. There was no escape. The last thing I heard was the faintest whisper, cutting through the thickening air. It's too late. The darkness closed in. And then, there was nothing. I woke with a start, gasping for air, my chest heaving as if I had just emerged from underwater. The fog was gone. The shadows were gone. The eerie figures, gone. I sat up, blinking rapidly, trying to make sense of my surroundings. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had just experienced. I was still on the road. The same road. But everything around me looked different, too still, too quiet. There were no more figures, no more mist. The night was silent, and the air was unnaturally still. I looked up at the sky. The stars were gone, swallowed by a thick, black void. The moon, which should have been high above, was nowhere to be seen. The road stretched ahead of me, empty. The faintest glow, far in the distance, flickered like a dying light. My legs were weak, my body sore, but I knew that I couldn't stay here, frozen in fear. I had to keep moving. There had to be an answer somewhere down this cursed path. I stumbled to my feet, my mind racing, each step a battle against the heavy weight of terror that had settled in my bones. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by the fog? The shadows? Was I still trapped in whatever nightmare this place had become? No. Something inside me screamed that this was no illusion. It was real. The road, the fog, the figures, everything was real. And I was still a part of it. I forced myself to move forward, my eyes never leaving the distant flicker of light. It beckoned me, but there was something else, something darker, that pulled me in that direction. I couldn't ignore it. But as I walked, I began to notice something that didn't sit right. The road was changing. Subtle at first, but undeniable. The cracked asphalt shifted beneath my feet as if it were alive. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but the landscape around me never seemed to change. The trees, once far in the distance, now lined the road on both sides, their twisted branches leaning in, creating an oppressive canopy. The air felt thick, like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I stopped. There was a sound, a faint rustling in the underbrush. A shuffling, almost as if something was moving just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head to the side, scanning the edge of the road. But there was nothing. The rustling stopped, leaving only silence. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding my thoughts. I had to focus. I had to stay on the road. I had to reach the light. But as I took another step forward, a voice, soft and unrecognizable, whispered from somewhere within the trees. Turn back. My blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. I couldn't place it, but it sent a jolt of terror through my veins. The voice was one of the shadows, one of the figures. No, this was different. This voice felt personal. It felt like it was calling to me, pulling me into the unknown. I took another step. The road stretched ahead, but the light was still far off, teasing me with its unreachable glow. I kept walking, ignoring the voice, the shuffling, the growing sense of dread gnawing at the back of my mind. And then, I heard it again. Turn back, now! I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice wasn't just calling to me anymore. It was closer. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my heart racing. But the road behind me was empty. Silent. But I knew it wasn't. The road was never truly empty. Not anymore. I could feel it, the presence. It was there, behind me, lurking just out of view. The sound of soft breathing, slow and deliberate, came from the darkness. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. The air was heavy with it, thick with its malignant energy. I was no longer alone on this road. And whatever it was that followed me, it was closing in. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs were frozen to the spot, as if something was holding me there. Something unseen, but all-encompassing. The breathing grew louder, faster. My pulse quickened. "Don't look back," the voice whispered again, its tone now unmistakable. It was the same voice from the shadows. The figures that haunted my nightmares. They had followed me into the waking world. I turned around, finally breaking the grip of paralysis, but as I did, I felt the road beneath me shift again, more violently this time. The ground trembled, cracking like 1,000 breaking bones. I ran. I had no choice. I had to move. With every step, the shadows crept closer. I could hear the whispers, the ragged breathing, the sound of something moving, stalking me through the mist that had begun to return. The light, now close enough to touch, flickered more rapidly, as though it were struggling to hold on to its very existence. But I knew now. The road wasn't leading me to salvation. It was pulling me deeper into its grip. The light wasn't a way out. It was the end of the line. And the road, it seemed, would never let me go. With the darkness closing in, I could hear the voice one last time, soft but unmistakable. "Welcome home." Have you ever had that feeling, like someone's watching you, even when you know you're alone? It started as a simple sensation for me, one I could easily dismiss. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing away at work, or lying on the couch watching TV, and then, just for a split second, I'd feel it. A light, almost hesitant touch on my left shoulder. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe my clothes brushing against my skin or the breeze from the cracked window. But it happened too often to ignore. I live alone. I've never been afraid of being alone before. It's something I've always enjoyed, actually, the quiet, the solitude. It's how I recharge after a long day of dealing with people. So why, in the last few weeks, have I been feeling followed? The first time it happened, I laughed it off. "Just a weird draft," I muttered to myself. But it came again. Then again. Each time, I'd turn, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. Just empty space. I'd try to convince myself that it was nothing more than the after effects of a tiring day, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. At first, the touch was gentle, fleeting, a slight pressure, as though someone's fingers had brushed against my skin. I'd look over my shoulder, expecting to see a person there, standing close, their breath warm against my neck. But there was never anyone. And after the initial surprise, it became almost routine. Like an itch I couldn't scratch. But then, the touches grew stronger. More deliberate. One night, as I was reaching for the remote, a firm hand pressed against my shoulder. Not a brush. not a whisper of a touch. No, this was different. It was solid, real. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly turned my head, feeling the weight of the hand still lingering on me. Nothing. Empty air. I pushed myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. There was no one in my apartment. It was just me, alone in my living room. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was just the weight of my own mind, working overtime. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd been watching too many horror movies. But the thing is, it didn't stop. The hand, the touch, it came every time I was alone. And the longer it persisted, the more it seemed to change. At first, it would just rest there, like someone was idly waiting behind me. Then, as the days wore on, the pressure increased. The hand would dig into my shoulder, like it was trying to pull me in, pulling me back. But when I spun around, again, there was nothing. It wasn't just physical anymore. It became mental. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me, waiting for me to do something. To react. And the strange part? It wasn't a feeling of fear, exactly. It was expectation. Like something was waiting for me to make the next move. To acknowledge it. To give into it. At night, I'd lock every door and window, turn off all the lights, and bury myself in blankets, hoping the darkness would swallow up whatever presence lingered around me. But even in the dark, it would come. The hand on my shoulder. The quiet weight of it. Sometimes it would be there when I woke in the morning, still lying on my skin like a memory. I started keeping track of the days, just to see if there was any pattern, any reason for this. Maybe it was connected to something in my routine? But there was nothing. Some nights, it would come 5 times. Other nights, just once. It didn't matter how many times I checked the locks or tried to shake it off. It was like it knew me. Like it had been there all along. Even now, as I sit here and type this, I can feel it again. The familiar weight on my shoulder, almost like a warning. A sign. I don't know what it means or what it wants. But I know this, it's getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can pretend it's nothing. Because the hand, the touch, it's not just a touch anymore. It's something else. Something much worse. And I think it's waiting for me to finally turn around. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to feel the hand again, but there was nothing. For a while, I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, letting my mind run wild with nerves and tiredness. I had a busy week ahead, and the last thing I needed was to obsess over imaginary touches. But the problem was, it wasn't imaginary. That night, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, scrolling through my phone, I felt the pressure again. At first, it was gentle, like someone's fingers brushing against my shoulder, just enough to make me pause. But then, it was more. It was firm, too firm. As though someone was deliberately gripping me, holding me in place. I froze. My heart raced, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. I was afraid of what I might find. The thought of a hand, an invisible hand, pressing down on me sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stayed still, breath held, trying to make sense of what was happening. The hand pulled away, just as suddenly as it had appeared. But I knew it wasn't over. It never was. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but once again, nothing. Empty air. My apartment was just as it had been, silent, still, and oppressive. I pulled myself together, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. It had to be. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the creeping effects of being isolated too long. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could feel the weight of it, like an invisible presence looming just behind me, waiting. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and restless sleep. The touch continued. It came every time I was alone. And each time it felt stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just a hand anymore. It was an entire presence, something that was there, watching, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The strangest part was that it felt familiar, like I had always known it. At times, I could almost hear its breathing, slow and deliberate, like it was studying me. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, as if it was trying to force me to confront it. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see something more, something I couldn't quite grasp. But there was never anyone there. I tried talking about it to a friend once. I thought maybe hearing myself say it out loud would make it feel less real. But when I started explaining the sensation, they just looked at me like I was crazy. "You need to get some sleep," my friend said, dismissing my concerns. "Maybe take a break from your apartment. You're overworked, that's all." I nodded, trying to smile through my unease. But the truth was, I knew it wasn't exhaustion. I could feel it. It was something else. And the longer I ignored it, the stronger it seemed to become. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. A soft rustling, like someone shifting behind me. Then, just as I started to relax, the pressure returned. Not on my shoulder this time, but on my back, just above my spine. A heavy, relentless pressure, like a hand pressing firmly against my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I lay there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to act, but I couldn't. The hand stayed there, unmoving, as if it had always belonged to me. And in that moment, it became clear to me, it wasn't just some random presence. It was something that had been attached to me, something that had always been there, watching, waiting. The silence stretched on, but now it felt more like a command. A pressure. A feeling that I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more impossible it seemed. All I knew was that whatever this was, it wasn't leaving. Not until it had something for me. I had to find out what it wanted. But deep down, I was afraid I already knew the answer. The next morning, I woke up to an empty apartment. The oppressive weight from the night before was gone, but it still lingered in my mind. I wanted to believe that it was all a bad dream, that maybe my imagination had run wild after too many sleepless nights. But the reality of it gnawed at me like a persistent itch I couldn't reach. The hand. It felt so real. It was real, and I knew it now. I couldn't sit still. I needed to do something, anything, to take my mind off it. So, I went to work, trying to focus on the mundane tasks of the day. But the moment I stepped into my apartment that evening, the air changed. It was thicker now, almost suffocating. The faintest noise, like a creak in the floorboards, echoed in the silence. I dropped my bag, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, the presence, just out of sight. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was there, watching me. Waiting. The apartment felt different, as though it were twisting around me. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I moved through the rooms, trying to shake the feeling, but it only intensified. I reached the bathroom, and that's when I saw it. A smear of something dark on the bathroom mirror. It wasn't a handprint, not exactly. It looked more like a smudge, a faint impression of fingers. I wiped it away, but it stayed. Just as I was about to walk away, something made me look closer. There was something scrawled in the foggy glass, hidden in the corner. "Get out." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out everything else. I wiped at the mirror again, but the writing didn't disappear. It was still there, as though it had been burned into the glass. I stumbled back, nausea rising in my stomach. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. The temperature dropped, and a shiver ran through me. I turned quickly, expecting to see something or someone behind me. But there was nothing. The room was empty, the bathroom silent once again. But the feeling, it didn't leave. It clung to me like a second skin, and no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. I tried to leave the apartment that night. I couldn't stay there, not with the hand on my shoulder, not with the message on the mirror. But when I reached for my keys, the door slammed shut, as though something were holding it closed. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A soft click echoed from behind me. I turned, and there it was again. The sensation of a hand on my shoulder. Only this time, it was colder. The fingers dug into my skin, and I gasped. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, so real, so unmistakable. My legs trembled, and I couldn't breathe. The air around me grew thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking with each passing second. I couldn't escape. "Please, stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. The hand didn't let go. It just pressed harder, and then I heard it. A voice. Quiet, but unmistakable, whispering in my ear. "You can't run from me." I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty, oppressive darkness of my apartment. I backed away, my pulse racing. The walls seemed to stretch outward, but the room didn't grow larger. It became more distorted, as though the space itself was bending in on itself. I couldn't make sense of it. In a panic, I rushed for the door again, but the handle didn't turn. The sound of the voice filled my mind, growing louder, more insistent. "You're mine now." I pounded on the door, desperation consuming me. I couldn't breathe. The presence was everywhere, pressing in on me from every direction. The air became so thick, I thought I might suffocate. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, panting, my heart hammering in my chest, my entire body trembling. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that I had lost my mind. But the handprints on the mirror remained, and the feeling, the terrible feeling, still lingered. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. Not until it had taken what it wanted. And deep down, I feared that I already knew what that was. Me. I spent the next few days in a haze, half convinced that I was losing my grip on reality. Each time I returned to the apartment, it felt more like a prison. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light, every gust of wind outside, everything felt loaded with meaning, as if the apartment itself was conspiring against me. I could almost hear it breathing, its wooden beams groaning under some invisible weight. But the hand, no matter how many times I told myself it was just my imagination, was there. And so was the voice, faint but ever present, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I tried to avoid staying there at all costs. I stayed out late at work, and when I couldn't stand being in the office anymore, I took long drives, not really sure where I was going, just desperate for a sense of control. But each night, the apartment called me back, as if it knew that no matter how far I went, I'd always return to it. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I was done waiting for answers. I had to confront whatever was haunting me, whatever it was that refused to let me go. I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, or spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained, but something inside me knew this was no ordinary experience. I had to know. I armed myself with everything I thought might help: candles, incense, even a set of holy symbols I had found stuffed in a drawer. I wasn't religious, but I was desperate. I set everything up in the center of the living room, trying to create some sort of safe space. I sat down in front of it all, forcing my mind to be still, even as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move of their own accord. The air was thick, oppressive, like a storm was about to break, only there were no clouds. It wasn't long before the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of something moving behind me. I didn't turn around. I wasn't sure I could if I wanted to. My heart was pounding in my chest, my pulse a frantic beat that drowned out everything else. The hand, it was back, that cold, unyielding pressure on my shoulder, like a warning. I closed my eyes, clenching my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like a plea, like I was bargaining with something that didn't care for my words. The answer was a sharp, chilling laugh that seemed to echo through the apartment. And then, that voice. "It's not what you think." I shuddered. My thoughts raced. What did it mean? What was I missing? Slowly, painfully, I forced myself to turn around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows, darker than before. The hand was still there, on my shoulder, cold and unyielding. I could feel the pressure, but the room itself seemed to blur, as though the space I occupied was stretching beyond my control. The walls were moving. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The apartment wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just inhabited by something, it was something else entirely. The apartment was a trap, and I was its prey. The voice spoke again, this time right beside my ear. "You shouldn't have come back." I gasped, scrambling to get up. But before I could move, I felt something grab my wrist, tight, unyielding, colder than ice. I screamed, pulling away, but the grip only tightened. My breath caught in my throat as the world around me seemed to collapse, the apartment folding in on itself. The corners of the room darkened, and for a moment I couldn't see nothing but blackness. And then I saw it. A figure, darker than the shadows, standing across the room. Its shape was distorted, like it was made of the same darkness that surrounded me, stretching unnaturally tall. The face, or what I assumed was the face, was a blur, like the edges of a nightmare I couldn't escape. I couldn't make out its features, but I didn't need to. The air felt suffocating, as if the very presence of this thing was draining the life out of me. I staggered back, but the grip on my wrist didn't loosen. It felt like the floor itself was shifting beneath me, the walls closing in tighter with every passing second. And then, the whisper. "It's too late." I tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in my throat. My body felt heavy, as though I were sinking into the floor. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. "You belong to me now." The words echoed in my head, louder than the pounding of my heart. The room was no longer the apartment I had moved into. It was something else, something twisted and wrong. The walls seemed to close around me, the floor beneath me starting to disappear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. And as I felt myself being drawn into the inky blackness, a final, horrifying realization crept over me. I hadn't been living in an apartment. I had been living inside the nightmare. And now, it had claimed me. I couldn't breathe. The world around me was vanishing, folding into a nightmare that threatened to swallow me whole. My pulse raced, my head spinning as the grip on my wrist tightened further, dragging me down into the darkness. The oppressive air was thick with an almost tangible weight. I could no longer feel the floor beneath my feet. I wasn't just sinking, I was disappearing into something that defied all logic, all reason. My mind screamed in protest, trying desperately to hold on to any sense of reality, but it was slipping through my fingers like sand. The walls, the apartment, the familiar setting of my life, it was all fading away, replaced by an abyss of shadows that stretched into infinity. I felt cold, not just physically, but in my soul, as if the very essence of me was being consumed by this place. And then, there was silence. The hand on my wrist was gone, and the pressure on my chest had lifted. But the relief was short-lived. The darkness that surrounded me now felt heavier, deeper. And in the midst of that silence, I heard a voice. It wasn't the same whisper from before, but something far older, far colder. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice had no warmth, no compassion. It was a voice of emptiness, echoing through the void as though the very fabric of space was speaking to me. "This is not your world. It never was." I turned my head, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to see, only the thick, suffocating blackness. Yet, I could feel something watching me, observing me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in this place that felt like it existed outside time and space, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The voice continued, its tone relentless and chilling. "You are a part of it now. The apartment is the gateway. It calls to those who are weak, those who seek refuge in its walls. But it is not refuge you find here. Only a dark, unending belonging." A shudder ran down my spine. The apartment was never just a building. It was never just a place for people to live. It was a hunger, a force that consumed those who entered, wrapping them in its cold, suffocating grip. It had been calling me from the moment I stepped through its door, and now it had claimed me. The walls began to shift again. Slowly, they came alive, their edges distorting, twisting in unnatural angles, as though the very structure of the building was warping. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, mold, mildew, something that had been left to rot for far too long. The darkness flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow, a shape, standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall, its features obscured by the oppressive blackness that surrounded it, but there was something familiar about it, something that made my stomach turn. "You are not the first," the voice said, its tone growing colder, more detached. "You are not the first to seek refuge here, but you will be the last to leave." The figure in the corner moved, its form flowing like liquid darkness, shifting and distorting with every step. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, as though the laws of physics had no power over it. The shape hovered toward me, its presence growing heavier, more suffocating with every passing second. I wanted to scream, to fight, but there was nothing left in me. The terror had drained me of all strength, leaving me a hollow shell. The shape loomed over me now, its form a twisted silhouette, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, the words that followed sealed my fate. You were never meant to survive this. It was then I understood the truth. The apartment wasn't just haunted by spirits or ghosts. It wasn't just cursed. The apartment itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that fed on fear, on despair. It fed on its residents. And once it had chosen you, there was no escape. The figure reached out, its hand like a vice, grabbing my arm. The coldness seeped into my skin, spreading like ice through my veins. I tried to pull away, but it was no use. I couldn't escape. The room was closing in on me, the walls pressing in with an impossible weight. The apartment was taking me in, devouring me. You belong here now, the voice echoed, louder now, as if it was coming from everywhere. And you will never leave. I gasped for air, but none came. The last thing I saw was the darkness consuming me, the room swallowing me whole, until there was no more light. No more sound. No more space. I had become a part of the apartment, just another soul lost to its hunger. Another nameless figure in the shadows, destined to wait forever. And so, I was forgotten. Have you ever noticed how, over time, something around you can start to change in ways that are almost imperceptible? At first, it's just a small detail, something you can easily dismiss. A slight difference, a feeling that you can't quite shake. But eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. The people around you, the voices that were once familiar, begin to sound different. Alien. You can't explain it, but you know something's wrong. That's how it started for me. It wasn't immediate, not something I could point to and say, that's where it began. It crept in, slowly, insidiously, until it became the air I breathed, thick with unease. It began with a voice I knew well, one I had heard 1,000 times. My best friend, Tom, had always been the kind of person you could rely on for a laugh, for advice, for anything. His voice, familiar and warm, had always been a constant in my life. But one evening, when I was sitting in my apartment, staring out of the window into the dimming streetlights, I heard him call my name. I turned, expecting to see his familiar face at my door. Instead, I was met with nothing. The voice had sounded off, though. It was his voice, but wrong. Not the way it should sound. It was more hollow. Like there was something missing. Something inhuman. And then it happened again, just as I was starting to shake off the feeling, just as I thought maybe I was imagining things. Jake, the voice was clearer this time, but there was a strange quality to it, like it was being filtered through static. Like it wasn't even coming from Tom himself, but from something behind him, something standing in the shadows. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just the isolation, the silence of my apartment that made me jump at shadows. But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, it got worse. At work, I noticed the same thing happening. The people I spoke to, friends, coworkers, even strangers, sounded off. Their voices became distorted, hollow, as if someone had taken their real voices and replaced them with something wrong. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but it happened too often to be a coincidence. I spoke to Sarah, a colleague who sat next to me, about it one morning. Her voice had always been soft and melodic, but now it had a peculiar, unnatural sharpness to it, as though something was pressing down on it. "Sarah?" I asked hesitantly, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Yeah, Jake," she responded. But even then, I felt it. That something wasn't right. "Your voice, it sounds different," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She blinked at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Different? How?" "I don't know, just not the same," I replied, trying to find the right words. "Like you're not, you." She laughed, a quick, nervous laugh. "You're being weird, Jake. Maybe you're just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was afraid. Afraid of something I couldn't understand. It wasn't just Sarah. It wasn't just Tom. It was everyone. The voices around me had started to blend together, each one more distorted, more alien than the last. They sounded like they were being pulled from some deep, unreachable place, something beyond the normal realm of human speech. Something wrong. By the time I got home that night, I couldn't escape the feeling of being surrounded by these unnatural, hollow voices. The apartment felt different now too. The air seemed heavier, the walls closing in on me, pressing down. I started to hear whispers, just barely audible, like they were coming from all around me, but when I tried to focus on them, they vanished, leaving only silence. I tried to call my mother to ask if she'd noticed anything strange, but when she answered the phone, her voice too was different. The warmth, the familiarity I had always felt when hearing her speak, was gone. She sounded distant, detached, as if I were speaking to a stranger. "Mom?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "What's going on?" "Your voice. It's not you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a voice that didn't sound like my mother at all. "You shouldn't have come back." The words chilled me to the bone. My heart raced, the phone shaking in my hand as I clutched it tighter. I tried to speak again, but the line went dead. The dial tone echoed in my ears, an empty sound that made my stomach turn. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear them, those voices, echoing in my mind, in the darkness. They were getting louder, more insistent, as if they were all around me, whispering in my ear. They were coming for me. I could feel it. They wanted something from me, something I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't escape it. The voices were taking over, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to my own. I sat up in bed, sweat pouring down my face, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to do something. I had to find out what was happening before it was too late. But as I moved to get out of bed, I heard it, one final whisper. "Your voice is next." It was in my own voice, but it wasn't mine. It was a hollow, empty version of it, just like all the others. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was losing myself. Piece by piece. Voice by voice. And there was no way to stop it. The air in my apartment felt colder now, even though the heating was running. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, as if they were shifting, waiting for something. I wasn't sure if I could trust my senses anymore. Every sound, every sight, felt like it could be a trick, a distortion of something that should be normal. The voices had already started taking over everyone around me, and now I fear I was next. I rushed out of my apartment the next morning, determined to find answers. I needed to speak to someone who could help me make sense of this nightmare. My mind raced as I walked down the empty hallway toward the building's front door. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, and the silence around me felt suffocating. The people I passed in the lobby didn't even seem to notice me. They didn't even look at me. But as I walked past them, I caught snippets of their conversations, or at least what I thought were their conversations. Their voices were so distorted now, I could barely recognize them. A man in the corner of the lobby muttered something that sounded like my name, but the tone was all wrong. It wasn't just unfamiliar, it was hollow, empty. I didn't stop to hear more. I rushed out into the street, needing to get away, to find some answers. But the outside world felt just as wrong. The sounds of traffic, the hum of distant conversations, the usual noises of the city, it was all wrong. The voices blended together in a jarring, incomprehensible mix. They didn't belong to the people around me. It was as if the very fabric of the world itself had become distorted, altered. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could tell what was real. I tried to find a place to think, somewhere I could be alone without hearing the eerie whispers that were beginning to consume my thoughts. The park near my apartment was the closest refuge I could think of. But even there, something wasn't right. The park, usually peaceful and filled with the sound of birds or children playing, was eerily silent. The trees stood still, their branches stiff, their leaves unmoving, as though the wind itself had abandoned the world. I sat down on a bench, hoping for clarity. My mind raced, but no matter how much I tried to focus, the voices crept back into my head. I couldn't escape them. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the world around me. That's when I heard it. A voice. Low, barely audible, but undeniably familiar. Jake. I opened my eyes, looking around in a panic. There was no one there. The voice wasn't coming from anyone I could see. It was coming from inside my own head, but it wasn't my own. It was someone else's, someone I couldn't place. And then, something even worse happened. I realized that it wasn't just one voice. There were others, echoing in my mind, as if they were all speaking at once. You're losing yourself, Jake. We're taking everything from you. I jumped up, my heart pounding, my thoughts scrambled. There was no time to think. I had to do something, anything. But what could I do when it felt like the very essence of reality was slipping away? My grip on what was real, on who I was fading, and there was no one around to help me. I ran back home, feeling like I was being pursued, like something, or someone, was following me. The streets seemed to close in, the buildings looming taller, their shapes distorting as I hurried through the alleys. Every voice I heard, whether it came from passing pedestrians or echoing off walls, sent a shock through my spine. The whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, more urgent. I slammed the door behind me when I finally reached my apartment, locking it and pressing my back against the door as if it could protect me from whatever had invaded my mind. You're running out of time, Jake. We're here. It was the voice again. That voice. It was all around me now, pressing in from every direction. I could hear it inside the walls, in the air, in my head. The voices I had once known, once trusted, were now just echoes of themselves, twisted, alien. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. The walls were closing in. The voices were getting stronger, and I was starting to lose control. I needed to leave. I needed to find a way to escape the thing that was stealing more than just voices. It was stealing us, our very souls. One voice at a time. But as I reached for the door to leave, I froze. A soft knock echoed through the apartment. At first, it seemed normal, just a knock on the door. But I knew better now. I knew the voices were coming for me. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges, as if pushed by a presence I couldn't see. I held my breath, stepping back. A figure stepped inside, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. And when it spoke, its voice was not its own. It was every voice I had heard. Every distorted, twisted version of the people I knew. "Jake, we're not done yet." And that's when I knew. There was no escape. Not from the voices. Not from what was taking them. It wasn't just the voices anymore, it was the way the air felt when they spoke. It had a strange heaviness, as if each word carried a weight that pressed against my chest. The temperature seemed to drop, but only around the person speaking. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. Every time someone spoke, I had to force myself to breathe. At first, it was small things, subtle, like the faintest change in tone or pitch, things you could dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But then, it wasn't just that. It was how the words didn't quite match their faces. People would say one thing, but I could see their lips forming different words, or worse, no words at all. The silence would stretch, just a beat too long, before the sound came back, disjointed, like an echo in the wrong place. I stopped talking to people. I started avoiding conversations. The discomfort became overwhelming. When I was forced to interact with others, I felt a strange disconnection, as if I were speaking to shadows or ghosts. But I still heard their voices, unmistakably theirs, but wrong, distorted. And then it happened again. That moment I thought was just a slip, a trick of my mind, turned into something more sinister. I was at work, sitting at my desk when Sarah, the woman who sat across from me, spoke. She asked me if I wanted some coffee. I nodded absent-mindedly, my gaze still fixed on the screen. But then I heard it, a voice, clear as day, coming from behind me. "Don't trust her," it whispered, the words so close I could almost feel them against my ear. I froze. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I knew. But it was so close, like it was inside my head, pushing against my skull. I turned quickly, my eyes darting around, searching for the source. Sarah was still sitting at her desk, her back to me. But she wasn't looking at me. She was staring ahead, her lips moving slightly, as though she were speaking to someone else, someone invisible. Then the air shifted again. The familiar hum of the office, the clinking of keyboards, and the murmur of quiet conversation all seemed to fade. In their place, a low, persistent hum grew louder, like a machine that was about to break down. It was the same feeling I had every time I heard those voices, not just in my ears, but in my bones. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Was I losing my mind? Or was something more sinister at play? I stood up, my legs trembling, the office spinning around me. The whispers, now louder, seemed to come from everywhere, inside my head, behind my back, beneath my feet. Suddenly, I felt it, cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. The hand was invisible, yet I felt it distinctly, pressing against my skin, as if it were claiming me. I spun around, but there was no one there. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder. "Stay, or run." I didn't know how long I stood there, my eyes scanning the empty office, searching for something that wasn't there. The oppressive silence pressed against me, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the spot. My heart raced, my palms slick with sweat, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the place where the voice had come from. I blinked, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. But the room remained still. No one seemed to notice the tension in the air, the unsettling presence that clung to the space. I swallowed hard and tried to breathe normally, but it was impossible. The voice returned. "Don't look for them," it whispered again, this time softer, almost a sigh against my ear. I could feel the chill of it creeping into my spine. My hands gripped the edge of my desk, and I turned quickly, staring at Sarah, who had now stood up, pacing slowly, her back still to me. She didn't speak, but the tension in her body told me something was wrong. She was walking too deliberately, as though each movement was an effort, as if she was tethered to something unseen, something holding her back. I had to get out of here. Without thinking, I grabbed my things, shoving them hastily into my bag. The voice in my head was louder now, like a cacophony of whispers blending together. They were saying something, but I couldn't make sense of it. Fear tightened its grip around me as I rushed toward the exit. The door to the hallway seemed impossibly far, and as I made my way through the office, the whispers grew more intense, more frantic. I could almost feel their hands on me now, brushing against my skin, tugging at the edges of my clothes. Each step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was holding me back. Finally, I reached the door, flinging it open and stumbling into the dimly lit hallway. It was quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was breathing hard, my pulse racing, but the whispers had stopped. Or had they? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the moment I did, I heard it again, louder this time. "Leave," it said, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, it wasn't Sarah. I whipped around, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was no one. The hallway was empty. But the voice persisted. "Run. Now." The voice faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me standing in the hallway, my mind spinning. The building felt larger now, more labyrinthine than it had moments ago. I had to get out. I needed to find an exit, but my legs felt like they were encased in concrete. The walls seemed to stretch and narrow around me, and the low hum of the lights above became a deafening buzz. I forced myself to take a step forward, and then another, my breathing shallow. The hallway seemed endless. There was a door to the left, one I'd never noticed before. I hesitated. Should I take it? Or would it lead me deeper into the unknown? "Leave," the voice repeated, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a command. I reached for the door. My hand trembled, but I pushed it open. The creaking sound echoed through the silence, amplifying the tension in the air. Beyond the door, the room was dark, but I could make out the shapes of furniture, a desk, chairs, a window that led to a view of the city below. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and immediately felt a cold draft sweep through the space. I looked around, feeling as if I were being observed, though I couldn't see anyone. The room felt off. Too still. Too empty. "Why are you still here?" The voice whispered again, but it wasn't from outside this time, it was inside my head, as if it had rooted itself deep in my mind. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see something, anything, out there, but the streets below were empty. No cars, no people. Just the empty, silent night. My pulse thudded in my ears. I should have left. I should have gone home hours ago. A soft scrape against the floor behind me jolted me out of my thoughts. My head snapped around, but there was nothing there. "Do you hear it?" the voice asked. "Closer now?" The whisper was so near, it was as though it were coming from the space just behind me. I spun, heart racing, but again, there was nothing. Nothing except the unnerving stillness. But the voice didn't go away. It lingered, pressing against my thoughts. "Why do you stay when you can't even trust the sounds around you?" I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to steady myself. This couldn't be real. None of this could be happening. I had to be imagining things. But even as I thought that, I could feel it, the growing sense of dread, of something just beyond my reach, something invisible that was getting closer and closer. I couldn't stay here. I turned back toward the door. The hallway beyond was as dark as ever. I had to leave. My feet moved on their own accord, as though guided by some unseen force. But the further I went down the corridor, the more the sense of wrongness deepened. The walls seemed to press in on me, narrowing the space. The dim light overhead flickered erratically, casting long, disturbing shadows. And then I saw them. Figures. Shadows. Standing just ahead of me, right at the end of the hall. I froze. There was no sound, but the figures stood motionless, as if waiting for me. And then, as I took a hesitant step forward, one of them moved. It was slow at first, a shift in the shadows. A blur of motion. But then, the shape became clearer. A person? No, not a person. The figure was wrong. The proportions were off, too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways. It was no longer a shadow. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't explain. And it was coming toward me. My body refused to move. I couldn't look away from the figure as it advanced down the hallway. Its form stretched unnaturally as it glided toward me. Each step it took was slow, deliberate, almost as if it was savoring my terror. My heart pounded, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat closed up as though the very air in the hallway was choking me. The figure was close now, too close, and with it came an overwhelming sense of cold. The temperature dropped so rapidly that I could see my breath in the air, fogging up in front of me like an apparition. My legs shook, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there. I had to get out. I had to run. But as I turned to flee, I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, closer than before. No, it couldn't be. My mind screamed at me to believe it was all in my head, to turn around and face what was chasing me. But the weight of fear kept me rooted to the spot. My hands clutched at my sides, nails digging into my flesh as I tried to steady myself. And then, just as I took a step forward, I felt it. A hand. It was cold and solid, its fingers pressing down on my shoulder with an icy grip. I gasped in shock, spinning around, but the hallway behind me was empty. There was no one there. Nothing. Except for the suffocating sensation that something was very wrong. I tore myself free from the invisible grasp and stumbled toward the nearest door, flinging it open with desperate urgency. But it wasn't much better. The room was small, cluttered with what appeared to be discarded furniture. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my ears. The voice returned. It was louder now, almost mocking in its tone. "You can't run from me. You can't escape." I pressed my back against the door, sliding down to the floor. My mind was in chaos, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. No matter how far I ran, it felt like the building, this cursed place, was closing in around me. Every corner, every shadow seemed to stretch and shift with a life of its own. Suddenly, there was a sound, a noise unlike any I'd heard before. A soft, rhythmic tapping, as though fingers were drumming lightly against the floor. I looked toward the source, but there was nothing. Yet the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent, as though something, or someone, was trying to draw my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't bear to look, but my eyes were drawn to the corner of the room. There, in the darkness, a pair of eyes blinked open, just two glowing pinpricks in the vast blackness. They stared at me with an intensity that sent a wave of terror coursing through my veins. I wanted to scream, but the words died on my lips. The tapping stopped, but the eyes remained. And then, slowly, they began to move toward me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, every muscle in my limbs unwilling to respond. The eyes drew closer, and I could feel their presence more than I could see them, like a heavy, oppressive weight in the room. It was then that I heard the whisper. Soft, gentle at first, like the rustling of leaves on a windless night. But the words were clear. Too clear. You're not supposed to be here. The voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't like the voices of the people I knew. It was wrong. It was a voice that had no right to exist. A voice that belonged to nothing, to no one. It didn't sound human. And it certainly didn't sound like mine. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the sound, but it was as if the voice was inside my head, a whisper that filled every crevice of my mind. I heard it in the depths of my bones, felt it reverberating in the pit of my stomach. You're not supposed to be here, it repeated, its tone now harsher, more demanding. The eyes, they hadn't moved, but I could feel them, watching me, never blinking, always fixed on my every breath. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was too much, and my throat was closed tight, as though something invisible was pressing down on it. Suddenly, I felt the urge to speak, to answer, to beg. But the moment I opened my mouth, the voice came again, this time louder, sharper, demanding. Say it. You know you want to. Say it. I didn't recognize the words. I didn't recognize the urge. But something deep inside me was fighting against it. My hand trembled as I reached up to cover my mouth, desperate to silence whatever was trying to force its way into my thoughts. But it wasn't enough. I could feel it. Something was changing. My own voice, my own thoughts, were starting to slip away, like sand running through my fingers. The more I resisted, the stronger the voice became. I am you, it said, now not in a whisper, but in a deep, guttural growl. I am the one who speaks. I am the one who controls. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as if the building itself were alive, feeding off my fear. I could still hear the eyes, watching, waiting. The sound of my own heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I could feel my body slowly betraying me. The trembling of my hands, the quickened breath that I couldn't control, it was all becoming part of the nightmare. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But I had to fight it. I had to. A hand, cold, heavy, it rested on my shoulder. But it didn't feel like the hand I had felt before. This one was different. It wasn't just the touch. It was the weight, the pressure, like something was trying to push me into the ground, to crush me. No, I gasped, finally managing to force the word out, but that voice, didn't stop. No, you're mine now. I am you. The hand squeezed tighter, and a deafening crack echoed in my ears. I don't know how much time passed. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? Everything around me was a blur, fading in and out, like I was stuck in some endless loop, the same horrible reality repeating over and over again. The hand was still there, gripping my shoulder with a force that threatened to shatter my bones. I could feel the coldness of it seeping through my skin, crawling up my spine. And the voice, it didn't stop. It never stopped. I am you. You are me. You will never be free. Every word made my mind fracture a little more. Every whisper twisted my reality, unraveled the fabric of who I thought I was. It was as though I was losing myself, piece by piece, to this thing that wasn't even real. But it felt so real. It felt more real than my own thoughts, my own voice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. What was happening? A sudden surge of panic flooded my chest. I had to get away. I had to escape this nightmare, this thing that was consuming me from the inside out. I stumbled, but my legs gave way. I hit the ground hard, the cold floor pressing into my cheek, my body trembling uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help. But the words were not my own. They were trapped somewhere deep inside me, locked away by that voice. I felt the pressure on my shoulder ease. I didn't dare look up, afraid that if I did, I would lose all control. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt like they were made of lead, too weak to support me. And then, as if from nowhere, the room grew still. I couldn't hear the voice anymore. The grip on my shoulder had vanished. I was alone again. But the silence was deafening. I slowly lifted my head, my eyes scanning the empty space around me. The shadows were still there, lurking in the corners, but they didn't move. The room seemed wrong. It was too quiet. The air was thick, heavy, like I was suffocating in it. I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling with each movement. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced myself to move inch by inch toward the door. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before it consumed me entirely. As I reached the door, my hand trembling as it wrapped around the handle, I heard it again. The voice. But this time, it wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding. It was distant. Faint. Like a whisper carried by the wind. Goodbye, it said. But I'll always be here. Waiting. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The door wouldn't open. I pulled, twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me again. I pulled harder, slamming my shoulder against it, but it remained locked, trapped, just like me. And then I understood. The voice hadn't been mine. It hadn't been anyone's. It had been something that had taken over, consumed everything, even the space itself. It had never left. With one last, desperate attempt, I slammed my body against the door once more. This time, it gave way. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I looked back one last time. And there, at the threshold, standing just beyond the door, was a shadow. A figure, but not quite a person. It was nothing but a blur, shifting and changing with every passing second, as if it could never truly be seen. I ran, and I didn't stop. And somewhere in the distance, I could still hear the voice. Faint, echoing, whispering just out of reach. I am you. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.